And we are live. This is Dark Journalists. Oh, what a fantastic crowd we have out there tonight and the ideas from already for this special report. And tonight, of course, I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, it could be another Kennedy in the White House.
I am all for it.
This is very, very interesting indeed. Well, there's a lot of rumbling this week about Bobby Kennedy running for president, and that is RFK Jr. And he's got quite a platform and a lot of support to run on. And he made some very interesting comments that we're going to get into tonight as part of this Disclosure President. Very special episode. We're going to get into some of the other presidents in this whole arc from 1963 to 2024, which is next year, and the very, very important presidential election, which I want everybody to be on board for. There's been a lot of voices in the regular media and the alternative media just turning people off, saying, oh, presidential election doesn't matter, and, concentrate on so a councilman or something. Well, when push comes to shove, the councilman isn't going to get you disclosure. So we need something massive, and it has to be at the top. After all, it's a body politic. And tonight we're looking at the head of the body politic, after all, which the power that presides inside the United States presidency. We're going to get into those who have moved that forward and moved the culture forward with it, and also the inevitable fact that the president elected in 2024 has to be some stripe of disclosure after all. And if it's the wrong kind, if it's the CIA UFO threat style kind, then we're all in very deep trouble. But if something kind of miraculous happens on the hat trick that goes on, then we may end up with just the right president at just the right time. So we're going to get into all that tonight. I want to remind you that we're going to be taking your questions in the second half of tonight's program. And Miss Olivia is going to be putting those together for us. And Miss Olivia, how are we doing out there?
We are doing great.
Fantastic.
A lot of excitement about Bobby running.
Yeah. Well, I have some very interesting things to read that he said. Look, inevitably on this, originally, at the very outset, this is going to be a fight for the Democratic nomination from a very weak president, Stepford Biden, who's screwed up just about everything that's come his way, from the Afghan war to getting us involved in the Ukraine war, which there's no end in sight, Ukraine-Russian war, and no peace process. Can you imagine a really good sort of president right now would be putting together the highest minds, getting the best people, going to the Nobel Peace Prize and saying, where are those peace agreements? Let's sit down and study peace agreements that we've done. And let's send these envoys over here. Let's negotiate a world peace. Instead, they're giving all this money to Zelensky and printing up tons of money here. There's higher deficits, higher inflation. And now Stepford Biden's big plan is to tax everybody after unleashing 87,000 new IRS agents. So none of that reads well. And Biden is in an incredibly vulnerable position, politically speaking. And that's why a Democratic challenger like RFK Jr. could very well score an upset. And the upset would happen in New Hampshire. Well, an interesting thing happened on the way to that upset, which is the Stepford Biden people have already anticipated this move. And guess what? They've gone to the DNC and insisted that they don't fund anything in New Hampshire, and that New Hampshire becomes demoted past, and so that they have the, instead of having it traditionally like they do in January to kick off the political season, and we know everyone goes to New Hampshire to make that big impression, they want to have it in April, and they want South Carolina to be the first one because they figure they've locked in the machine there. So this is going to become very important. I'm going to get right into it right away, and also why you may end up in 2024 with this. That may be the fight, in fact, or there may be some kind of alliance here also. So there's a whole lot to talk about in relation to that. For sure, Trump is looking like the likely nominee on the Republican side. He's now beating DeSantis by 35 points in any of the Republican polls. So DeSantis, it looks like it's not his time to do this. And they're throwing a lot of spaghetti against the wall, for example, Nikki Haley and this kind of thing. But Mike Pompeo is next, and he should register a good 1% of the vote. But I think we can, what they're going to try to do is drive this Trump, legal case thing over the top and make sure that Trump doesn't have the ability to run. But interestingly enough, I'm going to tell you, because there's a little overview on the presidents tonight, that we actually had a president run, not a president, but a candidate run from jail. And that was Lyndon LaRouche in 1992. So it has been done, make no mistake. And certainly, if Biden keeps on the way he is and plans to run, he may be running from a jail cell. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Special Report. This is going to be a very, very explosive episode, because when I get into the 1963 aspect of the disclosure presidency, I have some heavy-duty things to reveal about a little-known figure associated with President Kennedy and his role in sort of helping JFK secure disclosure and the things that happened to him shortly after the president's assassination. It's an explosive story, and it continues on to this day as his family continues to seek answers in what happened. I'm going to get into all that tonight, and we are going to take a look at every president, but 63 and 24 are going to be a hardcore focus. And after all, that may be the link, which is we may be looking at another Kennedy presidency. Okay, first of all, let's get this. RFK Jr. tells New Hampshire crowd he's considering political run. Now, he went up there and gave some speeches where he criticized President Biden for doing these things, like moving the rules around. But he also, they wanted to get rid of any debate aspects going on. So they didn't want anyone who's running as a primary challenger that the DNC would support any debates. So RFK Jr. was just looking at these on a flat political basis. Never mind what's going on in the background, but just on a straight up basis that we have a weak president. And if you're a Democrat, he's going into a fight in 2024, which he doesn't look like he's capable of winning, especially with all the tanking economy and other things that are going on. Okay, now this is what RFK Jr. had to say. We have probably the greatest polarization in our country's history that we've ever had since the Civil War, a really dangerous polarization, Kennedy warned. Kennedy also reiterated his defense of New Hampshire's leadoff place in the presidential nominating calendar. The Democratic National Committee voted last month to move South Carolina into the first primary slot. This is a huge kind of backroom deal to support Biden. Kennedy praised New Hampshire's role in vetting candidates and criticized President Joe Biden for proposing that calendar. We have the president of our party, the president of the United States, who feels like he needs to move this primary to a state where he can better control the outcome. What does that say to people? Kennedy's 69. In addition to his work as an environmentalist, he's taught law school and has written numerous books. And we know he's been a leading critic of the COVID op and the pharmaceutical companies involved, and a lot of the politicians that are on the take with this. A few things happened recently which put him on an even more kind of hardcore position. And one of them was that, when they were rolling out these facts, and we got involved in this back in December when they were raising the idea that the records coming out of the National Archives may include the fact that the CIA assassinated President Kennedy. We've been talking about this for a long time in the groups that were involved, and also that President Kennedy was assassinated over the issue of UFO disclosure. Now, the group inside that did it is very interesting. We're going to get into them tonight, and we've called them Ex-Protect on this program. But there's a definite strong piece associated with aerospace around the Kennedy assassination, and we're going to show you exactly why that's possible. One of the things that RFK Jr. did when this started to get around, and it's interesting because as I mentioned this before, which is they raised the possibility that these records were going to come out. They didn't come out, but then the news headlines ran around like they did. It was one of the weirdest things I've ever seen. And this is the kind of faux disclosure I think we need to watch out for. And we need to watch for shows that are giving us very potent message around this, not the fluff on top. So Tucker Carlson had this whistleblower on his show who had access to those records, and he was supposedly had been in the CIA, and he said yes, the CIA was involved, but they never came out with anything about it. So it was left in this kind of, okay, well, Fox News said it on Tucker Carlson's show. But Tucker Carlson, who's going through a lot with all the J6 releases that he's doing with McCarthy, which is a healthy thing, that he's, he and McCarthy are putting those out because we know there was so much of a psyop attached to the things, the provocateurs that were involved. And, from both sides of the aisle, there's a lot of skepticism about what took place there. But in any case, there are shows like Tucker and some of these other shows, which, we can agree with on a number of things and acknowledge that they cover some positive topics, but it's a very superficial, especially when they get around the UFO thing. They're like, hey, we're going to get into the UFO reality tonight, and here's our guest, 2 CIA agents. The CIA is the one blocking UFO disclosure, so that doesn't wash. So, here's Elizondo or whoever. That's all, and a UFO disclosure operation. This is the narrative that they're working with. So we have to be very careful about what we call, the kind of genuine media on this. But in any case, the word was getting around, and they put this out. And RFK Jr. tweeted at the time, finally it's getting out that the CIA assassinated my uncle. Now, he himself has gone on the record saying that his dad, Robert Kennedy, who also was assassinated by the deep state, never believed that anything about the Warren Commission, of course. And, he looked to the Central Intelligence Agency for their responsibility in this. So can you imagine, after all these years, a Kennedy assuming the White House, his agenda would be, on a number of different levels, but just on this one level of the fact that, his dad and his uncle and the presidency being removed there back in 1963 as part of this. If he were to recapture the White House, this could be a remarkable turn of events for a number of reasons. Now, he's coming out on a platform, and that platform is about, we can't go on like this. We're losing the rights that, our families back to Jefferson have claimed, and we've fought for, we fought wars and we fought England in order to be free, and here we are giving up our freedoms left and right. So a lot of the issues that he's gone to bat for, environmentalism and anti this pharmaceutical takeover, have been incredibly effective, but he's also taken a lot of heat for those positions. So it seems to me, though, he's in an ideal position because of that backdrop and those coalitions that existed around the Kennedys, which were shored up, during the period of when President Kennedy ran and maintained his presidency for 3 years. Robert Kennedy came in and was going to be a very popular contender for the presidency. Ted Kennedy was popular in the Senate, of course. They leaned too far liberal and got into trouble when he ran for president against Carter. But some interesting things even happened there. There is still that strong recognition of the Kennedy name and the Kennedy machine underneath all this. And I think his position against Biden could be very, very important. What's interesting, of course, is that Trump selected Kennedy to be part of a vaccine council and was talked out of it by Bill Gates, of all people. And so this gets us into some very interesting territory, which we'll trek into tonight. But it's important for us to keep in mind this piece about the real shakeup for the 2024 campaign, which could be completely off the charts and blow everything away. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Special Report. This is Ex-President Disclosure. And we're going to be getting into tonight that arc from 1963 to 2024 and the inevitable role of the president coming in for 2024 will be disclosure. Do we get the real thing, or do we get the CIA sideshow circus? We're going to find out. We're going to take your questions in the second half of this program. We'll go a couple hours with you tonight. And of course, we're gearing up for the 5-year anniversary of the X series, which will be a 2-parter. And mark your calendars now. That's March 24th and 25th. at 8 p.m. Friday and Saturday nights. You don't want to miss those. We got some very, very important pieces of the puzzles there for you. Okay, before I go any further, Miss Olivia, you're up.
CC Jarvis wants to know if RFK Jr. is blocked by the DNC and DJT loses to DeSantis, do you think the two of them will pair up as independent apolitical candidates?
No, they're both going to run under their party flags. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Trump can't get unseated by DeSantis. DeSantis, although he has billions of dollars and Bush backers and things like that, and DeSantis, we have to say, has done a pretty good job in Florida and may have a bright future in relation to politics. He's done some good things down there. But right now it's looking like Trump's game. If you're up 35 points in the Republican primary, those are pretty good numbers for Trump, especially considering the shellacking that he's been taking since the last election. So we'll keep that in mind. Nothing's a done deal, of course. Even a couple of weeks is a lifetime in politics, but right now, it's looking very much like Trump is positioned to be the Republican nominee. And through some kind of miracle, we could get RFK as the Democratic nominee. So the dream kind of challenge for 2024 would be a win-win, I think, all around for it to be RFK, Bobby Jr. versus Trump in 2024. If it's not, what should happen here is that in any case, regardless of the outcome, we should be looking at unseating Biden for his atrocious record and the fact that he's not even there. He's completely controlled by a committee in the background. We have no idea who those people are, but we can guess. And for my money, we're headed for disaster if they try to roll in an 85-year-old Biden into the presidency. That's not going to work, and he was already very old and not doing very well when he got in. And, a lot of his moves were controlled, and we just don't want to project that image of, warlike insanity on the rest of the globe. We need new leadership, and the other nations of the world will respect the fact that we're moving in a totally different direction. So let's get there. Mm-hmm. Yes. What else you
got? Bug in the Garden wants to know, does RFK Jr. This is an important question. Was he at Epstein Island?
No, there's nothing. There's nothing about the Kennedys and Epstein that has turned up, and the whole kind of ethical course that the Kennedys have been on for a long time. We know that there's all kinds of stories in the Kennedy line about affairs and womanizing and all this kind of stuff. But again, that's emphasized very heavily. And you have to remember that so much of that happens in Washington anyway. So it's easy.
It's not so shocking anymore.
Well, there's been quite a program to desensitize us to the assassination of President Kennedy by making him just look like, this bed hopping, drug popping guy, instead of really looking at the incredible accomplishments of standing up against world annihilation that the military industrial complex was marching us into, and avoiding war in Cuba, avoiding nuclear war with the Soviet Union, and giving us an incredible ideal there with the space program. So we have to really honor the accomplishments of President Kennedy, and he is right in the spotlight tonight. Wait till I get into these things tonight, because a lot of it is a real mind blower, because I guarantee you a lot of you are not aware of Grant Stockdale. And Grant Stockdale was JFK's best friend, and he did a lot in the background for JFK. So we're going to get into that tonight, including being his ambassador to Ireland. Mm-hmm. Wearing the green, in fact. And, we know that President Kennedy went back to the homeland at some point, and that's that incredible trip to Ireland, which was very significant for a lot of people and very sentimental trip for him to take, a sentimental journey, as it were.
Mm-hmm. Jimmy Lyle Kennemer wanted to know, do Bobby and Trump have any prior relationship that you know of?
Well, Trump was close with JFK Jr., and when JFK Jr. was launching his magazine there in the 90s, George, Trump was around all of that. I think he was interviewed for the magazine. There's quite an interesting background with it. You know, they say that Trump has great respect for the Kennedys, and certainly he wasn't in a much of a political position, and he was actually supporting people in the background. But here's another thing: when we get into Trump, we're looking at this tonight. That's from the mid '90s there with JFK Jr., and we know there was a weird thing, you know, as we saw with the Q movement and all this other stuff. But then all the liberal newspapers try to make fun of this aspect that was promoted about, oh, JFK Jr. is still alive and all this bizarre nonsense that was clearly a psyop. But I think that it's interesting and significant in this sense, which is that, you know, JFK Jr.'s death was very mysterious. And the idea really being there that JFK Jr. Was eliminated in that plane crash because he was going to go to bat and take the Senate seat that Hillary Clinton wanted because she was still first lady at the time and it wasn't looking good for her. So they wanted to eliminate some competition there. That death, I've talked to a number of experts about it, and it's a very, very shady encounter. That is the real kind of scandal around JFK Jr. But when you see that connection in the background of Trump being close with him and being close with Nixon and others who we're going to run into tonight, then I think we know that there's a whole different relationship going on there in the background that's very significant. And so we should be keeping our eyes out for that. All right, everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, X Special Report, President Disclosure 2024. The Disclosure President coming your way. Let's get into some things that took place in 1963 that set us up for 2024 and a lot of problems in between. Now, one of the things that President Kennedy did, and I think this is significant, you know, we have to remember that President Kennedy did not get in. He got in by less than 100,000 votes. So it's a very small edge that they were able to pull off in that election. You know, Nixon was pulling off all of his favors, all of his mafia favors, all his political favors, every dirty trick that he could. And the Kennedys did everything that they could too. And of course, there was, you know, mafia working on both sides to try to make it happen because they wanted the best possible position. But the deep state was surprised that Kennedy won. And they had profiled him. And it's very unusual that they did this because they took out a profile of him before he was president. This is something that they usually do after the fact. And I think what they imagined that they could do is in that period between when he won the presidency and when he assumed it, that they could sway him and cause this whole Bay of Pigs takeover of Cuba, and then he'd be stuck as their kind of Cold War deep state puppet. And they underestimated him dramatically in that situation. In fact, they gave him his first major loss, which was the Bay of Pigs, after his victory over Nixon. But the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion, the CIA invasion of Cuba, which was an absurd idea, also made Kennedy very early on realize, oh, this is who I'm dealing with. And it gave him the ability to have the sort of agreements in the background and the reasons to fire Allen Dulles and his deputy, Charles Cabell. So there's a lot of connections there because, of course, Dulles and his brother, as Secretary of State and CIA director, had been basically running our foreign policy for the past couple of decades. And so when Kennedy gets in there, after the Bay of Pigs, he has that conversation with Dulles where he says, if this was the UK, I'd have to leave, but it's America and you have to leave. So that's a significant exchange that takes place. And I think if he wasn't already enemies with Dulles at that point, you know, by firing him, put him right in the crosshairs of the program that they were working on. Now, there's a lot of things that we can go into about Dulles, but what I want to do is get us to look at some of the people that Kennedy was using in the background. Now, here's an interesting thing about Kennedy. He had a habit of going around the State Department, going around the CIA to get his message out. For example, when he gave his speech at American University, which talked about respecting the Soviet Union and that we all breathe the same air and things of this nature, Kennedy gave a different speech to the State Department saying he was going to give this speech, and he snuck in this other speech, and they were shocked and they couldn't believe it because he said, you know, we shouldn't enforce on the world a Pax Americana with American weapons of war. We have to explore, these other cultures and find peace. Now, this was such a shock, but it sent great shockwaves in the right places over in Russia and across Europe, etc. The only place where it sent the wrong shockwaves was that intelligence community. And Ike did the same thing, by the way, by altering his speech at the last minute and inserting the military industrial part. So they knew how to get around this system. Another thing that happened in that little run up to the assassination was Kennedy started to trade messages with Khrushchev around the State Department because he found that the meaning of what he was saying was getting mistranslated. It was coming off harsher. They were adding things that were aggressive. And he also felt that every time he made a move, they would make a counter move in the background as soon as they knew what he had communicated to Khrushchev. So, and that is his own deep state I'm referring to here in the intelligence community in the background. So what he decided to do was to use journalists to deliver messages into Berlin. They would be picked up inside of a newspaper, and that newspaper, the person would go over to East Berlin, and then they'd have the message for Chairman Khrushchev. He did this also with Castro in the last year of his life. So Kennedy had these objectives of working in the background. He may have picked this up, this kind of very savvy quality, from his dad, who was ambassador to the UK, and also built the Kennedy fortune and all these different things. But one of the people that he utilized in the background was Grant Stockdale. And Stockdale becomes, I think, very important in the Kennedy story when we look at it. Now, here's the thing I want to get across about Stockdale immediately. We're going to start at the end. 10 days after President Kennedy is assassinated, Stockdale jumps out of a window 13 floors and dies in Miami. Now, this is a very unusual case. There's no suicide note. And also, before Stockdale died, he was saying to friends that he was being followed and that things were closing in. And he was trying to get on record with two different lawyers about what he knew. And he set up a special meeting with Ted Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, who he had known. He knew the whole Kennedy family for years. So that's sort of the end game. He attends the funeral and he meets with Bobby and Ted. And then he comes back from that and then he dies in this very, very unusual circumstances. I want to read some of the articles around that whole period just to give us an idea of Stockdale and also to give you a little more setup about how he met Kennedy and they became such fast friends in Congress when he was the administrative assistant for Congressman Smathers in Florida, who eventually became senator and was right in the heartbeat of this entire deep state operation back in 1963. Smathers, often overlooked for his deep aerospace ties and his deep ties to the Johnson and CIA machine, and also the fact that although friends with Kennedy for years, there are some very interesting arguments that were witnessed publicly with Senator George Smathers and JFK. One witnessed by people at a dinner party when Smathers was insisting that Kennedy arranged the assassination of Fidel Castro, and Kennedy broke a plate. Kennedy was very calm under almost every circumstance. Broke a plate with a fork at a dinner table, saying that he insisted that this not be a topic for conversation. He didn't want anything to do with it. So this is a very interesting and important person in the background, the senator from Florida, deep in the hot zone. So we're going to take a look at him now. But let's start with Stockdale and then some of the remarks of Stockdale's family. And like I said, I'm going to get through this, and then in the second half, we'll take your questions. And it's great to have so many of you with here. Before I go, what do you got? Okay, you're all set.
Mm-hmm.
Let's look at this. First of all, again, we'll walk it backwards. December 3rd, 1963, New York Times, former envoy, a friend of Kennedy, dies in fall. And look at what they say immediately after. It says, no ties to Baker case. This is very interesting and important because Bobby Baker had just been grabbed. And Bobby Baker was a business associate of LBJ. And also, he facilitated things like call girls and things for politicians. And he was in charge of bribes for LBJ in the Senate. But he had got caught up in the scandal, and interestingly enough, there are reports that come out later about Baker having an interest in a company that Stockdale owned and giving some kind of indication in the background that the two men knew each other. Now, what's also interesting about this is there's something I refer to often on this program, it's the Torbett document. And that is sort of like a 1970 WikiLeaks, where this torrent of information comes out about the JFK assassination, NASA, and the Garrison investigation. And in the middle of that, there's a little mention of Grant Stockdale and his relationship with Bobby Baker, which would seem a little bit unusual since Baker was really close to LBJ. And here you have the best friend of Kennedy spending all this time with Baker. We're going to get into that and how that came about. But here's another wonderful testament for the Torbett document, which is the Torbett document. When it came out, there was nothing on the record to suggest Bobby Baker and Stockdale knew each other, but the Torbett document knew it. So whoever was talking to Torbett and giving him that information had the inside track. And I think that's been proven over and over again. All right. Here we are, Grant Stockdale and President Kennedy. And this is just when Kennedy is getting out of Congress and getting into the Senate, and that's his good friends. This is the nature of their relationship. And they say they were inseparable. You know, he was in Florida, and when Kennedy would go down there, he would hang out with them when he was writing Profiles in Courage. He came over to keep him company when Kennedy had back surgery. They were just great friends. And Kennedy, not only rewarded him for his friendship, but also utilized him for certain things. For example, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, he had him go down there to the Miami Air Force Base and also to Homestead, which is where actually they kept UFO debris. But he said, I want you to check and see if they're loading bombs on the surveillance planes. And he said, because they're telling me they're not. So he would send him on errands like this. And, he went actually to the base and he said, he reported back to him and said, yeah, they're doing bombs. And he goes, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go back and I want you to say under special authority of the president that you want to touch the bomb. So this is a very strange thing that Kennedy was doing. He wanted it to be a 100% fact that his envoy had gone to this base and touched one of the bombs that had been loaded. So he could go back to the Joint Chiefs and the CIA and say, what the hell are you doing? And he didn't want it to be a room where this guy saw the bomb. He wanted him to go there and touch it. It's very interesting. I think we get an idea of the kind of caliber of Kennedy when he made decisions about things. He wanted the real hardcore facts on the table. Now, a few things about Stockdale and his strange death. Here's some of the obituaries in that period. Grant Stockdale, a good associate of John F. Kennedy, fell or was pushed from his 13th floor window on December 2nd, 1963 in Miami. The structure was called the DuPont Building. Although Stockdale did not write a letter, George Smathers, senator of Florida, who was the original person who introduced Kennedy to Stockdale, said that Stockdale had been upset as a natural result of the president's death. Now, that's true. He was upset his friend died. However, Stockdale's wife said that he was looking forward. He had all these plans for the future, and they had devised a number of things, and that the only thing that he was worried about were these people who were following him. So he had no, there was no suicide in the air, or I'm going to kill myself because my friend was assassinated. But Smathers is the one who puts that out immediately, and I think it gives us an idea of Smathers. Unfortunately, the things that I'm going to tell you about Smathers don't look very good for his operations in the background. Stockdale flew to Washington, D.C. to meet with Robert and Edward Kennedy barely 4 days after the assassination. This meeting was kept secret until much later. Now, this is interesting because, as I said, the Torbett document has the information about Stockdale. Now, the world was closing in, this is what Stockdale was saying to friends. When Stockdale returned from his vacation, he informed several of his close friends the world was closing in. Now, John Simpkin, who runs the Education Forum, that deals with so much information around JFK, he took a look at this kind of often ignored person in the whole picture. And Simpkins said that the death was directly related to the Kennedy case. And he said, I suspect Grant Stockdale told Robert and Ted Kennedy that he knew about the assassination, what he knew, on November 26. Stockdale was shocked when he discovered that the Kennedy brothers showed little interest in the story that he told them. Edward goes as far to undermine his credibility by questioning his mental state. Why did the Kennedy brothers do this? Why did they not want the case investigated? Now, the setup there is that Stockdale goes to Washington and he basically says, I've been doing all these things for your brother in the background. By the way, this is what your brother was worried about. And I believe this relates directly to the aerospace aspect around the assassination. And I don't think so much that the Kennedys didn't want to do anything about it. I think that Robert and Ted didn't have a lot of power at that point. Ted just got in the Senate, and Robert, although Attorney General, was getting shut out by J. Edgar Hoover immediately after Kennedy died, and LBJ, who hated him, was the president. It was very hard to go against that. And, we also have the idea there that somehow they would use the entire situation to besmirch the name of President Kennedy. So there were a lot of considerations going on. But as you can imagine, Stockdale, right off the bat, having these details in the background, he would be furious that they wouldn't do something immediately. And that was the information that was coming across. Let's get a little more on Stockdale. In 1954, Stockdale was named a member of Iron Arrow, an honorary organization of University of Miami graduates. He also several times was president of the University of Miami Alumni Association. He was married to poet Alice Boyd Stockdale. Now, she tells some very interesting stories, and she, after his death, gets threatened, and her children's lives get threatened, which I'm going to give you the kind of point-by-point, their actual account here shortly. His comment on the day of the assassination was, John F. Kennedy, our great president, is dead. Our magnificent American is gone. No man loved humanity more, nor served it better. He loved Miami and its people. Florida was his second home. This is the saddest day of my life. Alice Stockdale's book of poetry, To Ireland with Love, was published by Doubleday and Company. Now, John F. Kennedy had listened to her poems and said, you have to write a book of poetry. This is incredible. President Kennedy had urged her to publish it, and she dedicated it to Grant, with whom, hand in hand, I walked through Phoenix Park, and who will always be with me. So she's absorbing the shock not only of Kennedy's death, but Stockdale, who she knew was close. Now, she also knew some interesting errands that Kennedy had sent Stockdale on in the background. As I mentioned, he had made him the ambassador to Ireland, which he took up that position for a couple of years. And interestingly enough, when Stockdale went to Ireland to be ambassador, he spent all this money on lavish parties and things, entertaining dignitaries and stuff, and actually went broke because he didn't come from big money himself, Stockdale. He had a real estate business in Florida, and he did pretty well, and he was friends with Kennedy, and he had been in the Florida legislature, but he wasn't a congressman himself, and he wasn't wealthy. So, Kennedy basically had given him this incredible position, but there must have been also a reason beyond just here, be the ambassador to Ireland. He wanted him in that strategic position for some reason. So there is our friend Stockdale spending all this money and time there in Ireland. About 2 years in, he goes to Kennedy and says, what do you want me to do next? And Kennedy says, I want you back in Miami because of what's going on and the things I'm hearing. I want you to do basically some background information for me. So he resigns as ambassador to Ireland, and he heads back to America and starts to do things like spy on those bases for Kennedy and gives the information directly back to Kennedy, so the military-industrial complex can't be sort of giving him a big snow job. Now, all of this stuff is taking place, and at the same time, we have to remember that Stockdale's best friend is Smathers. Senator Smathers. So he's got Kennedy on one side and Smathers on the other. Smathers pretends to be a very good friend of Kennedy, but actually in some key arenas, like when Johnson is running against Kennedy, he forgets to do certain favors for him, and he blocks Kennedy from running as the candidate in Florida and runs himself as the favorite son so he can give the delegates away, and other weird things for which Kennedy was furious with him. So Smathers, Kennedy, it's a little bit uneasy. This guy is caught in the middle, Stockdale. A little more, just to give us some idea of the things that Stockdale did. He set up events for Kennedy as senator and president, and continued that close relationship. And like I said, in the background was basically, I don't want to say spying for Kennedy, but he was providing him with intel for situations. And Kennedy was using him as somebody who could really get him information in the background, because Kennedy felt he was, being given false information from the CIA and the military. Pretty much Stockdale became this voice in the background. And interestingly enough, some of the secrets that Kennedy shared with him may have been the reason that he was thrown out of that window, a la our friend, the first Defense Secretary Forstall, who was thrown out of a window at Bethesda. Now, here's some UFO file connections for us. First of all, James Forstall, who was a Catholic and very close to the Kennedy family, and John in particular, took John over to West Berlin after the Allies had liberated it. And it was completely destroyed. And Kennedy wrote this incredible article about it. There are all these pictures of Kennedy in post-war Berlin with Forstall. Forstall will show up in documents later as the person who wanted to share and be part of the X-Share group, and as part of the MJ-12 task force, had examined UFO wreckage and wanted to bring this out. It was also disturbed by it and by the level of secrecy around it. So whatever it is, the secrets that he took with him to his grave, it intersects with a lot of different things. Now, here's something unusual. During Memorial Day 1963, President Kennedy does the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier and all that, and then he makes a strange getaway with his friend Stockdale, and they go to visit, in fact, the grave of James Forstall, and the two of them go there and visit Forstall's grave. Now, there's a couple of interesting things about this, of course, the closeness that Kennedy had, but he had to go really out of his way in order to do this. And I think it's very symbolic for the forces that he's taking on, especially when we start to look at the UFO thread with Forstall as the reason that he was taken out. Another interesting thing just so happens, you could say it's kind of a coincidence, the last visitor that Forstall had, and this is 1949, in his hospital room there at Bethesda, was LBJ.
Whoa.
Doing the whole, hey, get better soon. So we need to keep that in mind. There's a lot of threads there which inform Kennedy's understanding of the UFO file before he's in office. So it's not just that Kennedy gets into office and then understands everything about the UFO file. He's got the background. But he learns a heck of a lot more once he's in office. And also the entire space program lands on his shoulders, and he decides, I'm going to take this, and make it our core mission. And we're going to promote this whole peace in space, science in space, and we're going to demilitarize the whole idea of going into space. And by his third year, he's actually working in the background with Khrushchev on a joint manned mission to the moon, totally different from what took place. So that's all significant background. But again, his friend Stockdale there, the person he's sort of giving this ultimate insider status to, and who's helping him a lot in the background. Stockdale will die 10 days after the assassination. And there's a lot of threats and things that are happening before he dies and after he dies in regards to his family. So let's get into some of that now. I want to say this about his family also, that in Stockdale's family, there he is with two of his daughters. He also has some sons as well. But this just seems to be a guy who was willing to do anything to help Kennedy along. And he met Kennedy when Smathers and Kennedy were in Congress. And that's 1946, Jack Kennedy getting sworn in along with everyone else. Smathers' administrative assistant, in fact, was Stockdale. And Kennedy's administrative assistant knew Stockdale, and they all started to hang out together. And that's how he came to be such a great insider. All right. Now, there's a couple of interesting things that happened, which is that Lee Stockdale, who's the son, really has put some interesting things on the record that I want to read here tonight. And then I want to read a very unusual report about someone who was working in physiology and psychology, who happened to run across in New Orleans a lot of information that would relate directly to the Kennedy assassination and also involve Stockdale and others. So let's first start with the son, Lee Stockdale, who writes much later about what the impact of the death of the father was. Now, I think he was 12 years old at the time. And again, I want to stress the involvement of Smathers. So let me line these people up again. Senator George Smathers, who was Congressman Smathers, and his administrative assistant became friends with Kennedy. That's Stockdale, who was the administrative assistant. And then through the 50s, Smathers works with Kennedy on a number of things as senators. And they both enjoy the friendship of Stockdale. Now, they also say that Smathers had a real tight relationship with the CIA, with LBJ, and with other deep state forces. And that what he was trying to do was get Kennedy swung over to their side. There's also a big NASA component with Smathers and the fact that they were developing the Space Coast at the time. So, we're deep in the hot zone almost immediately on this one. Now, here is what Lee wrote in a series of articles for a local newspaper in Florida. Quote, in May of 1962, Dad announced his resignation as ambassador to Ireland. He told the Irish Independent he had never intended to make diplomatic service a career and had responsibilities of his own. He had 5 children and he had to get back home to his business. Just days before we departed Dublin, Dad broke ground for the new embassy building, a proud achievement. My older siblings informed me that JFK expressly told Dad that he wanted him back in Miami to be the president's eyes and ears in South Florida, only 90 miles from communist Cuba, a political flashpoint. Dad's new office in Miami's DuPont building was directly across the hall from Senator Smathers' Miami law firm. Well, this is a pretty good, easy way to keep an eye on him. Smathers and Thompson was the name of the law firm. As soon as we got back, Dad went in with the chief on a 4-day trip. The chief is what they called JFK. They went to Colorado, South Dakota, California, and back to Washington. The Cuban Missile Crisis was 2 months away, but already Kennedy is hearing things. Just a little quick aside of something he wrote here, which is when he talks about his mom, because I think his mom is very important in all this. In May of 1962, Mom, a poet, loved to visit Irish writers in their homes, and I sometimes went along. There were these great visits because the writers were normal Irish people, not diplomats or government officials, and they were always present, creative and fascinating. I recall visiting Ireland's former president, Sean T. O'Kelly, at his home in Roundwood. He said seriously that although he had never personally seen a leprechaun, he once came upon a small cave and inside, perfectly laid out, was a complete leprechaun set of clothes. So he believed in leprechauns, which is really off the charts. So they spend all this time there, and then he comes back and he's doing this background work for JFK. Now, one of his real estate interests got involved with a vending company. And this is how he was making money in the background. And supposedly that company got aerospace contracts through NASA. there was a little bit of a flap with him around this. And, we're looking at early influence. And there are these letters from Kennedy to him saying, you took $5,000 as an interest-free loan from so-and-so, give it back. And Stockdale is saying, well, I need the money and everything else. And Kennedy's like, no, like, this is not how you do business. So I think that's important. Now, Smathers, when he gives his own oral history about Kennedy, this is his version of how Stockdale met Kennedy. He says, Stockdale fell in love with Jack Kennedy, and Jack Kennedy loved him. Later, Jack Kennedy made him ambassador to Ireland. When Jack got to be president, Ted Reardon was Jack's administrative assistant, and Ted and my guy Stockdale became intimate friends. And Jack and I were very close friends because Jack, as you can see from that picture, only weighed about 125 pounds. Of the fellows least likely to be president, this is 1948, you'd have to vote Jack number one. He only weighed about 125 pounds. He had this bad back, and he was not well. He was in pain. When they bring the bells for us to go over and have a vote of a quorum call, this guy would have a hard time getting over there. So what would happen is he'd come over and Stockdale would say, come on, Jack, let's go. He would lean on Stockdale or Ted Reardon, and we'd all kind of march over to the floor of the House of Representatives where he would cast his vote. So these guys, both Smathers and Stockdale, are becoming, they're helping Kennedy along. And Kennedy is, he's dealing with issues after the war where he obtained this back injury that really plagued him. But he had also some other illnesses when he was younger. So he had seen this end of the spectrum, this kind of like, staring illness in the face. And when he went over to the Far East, visited Vietnam and all that before the war and everything, he contracted a fever and was given the last rites and stuff. That was 1952. So he kind of engaged this. I think he understood how important life on Earth was all about. Now, here's a few things about Smathers and JFK that suggest maybe the friendship wasn't as close. And I think that this is important. So Stockdale was really close to Kennedy. Smathers was an opportunist who used the friendship, let's say. 1959, Smathers promised to help JFK become the Democratic candidate for president and he became head of the committee in the South to elect Kennedy. However, during the campaign, he surprisingly decided to run against Kennedy in Florida. Later, he admitted that he did this with the agreement of Lyndon B. Johnson. So Smathers is really, LBJ's boy, and he's playing up to Kennedy, but when push comes to shove, he's trying to get in there. So his explanation for it at the end of his life, recording his memoirs, Smathers says this: anyway, so here I was caught between Johnson on one side, who was my leader, Senate Majority Leader, and I was his whip. And here, my dear friend, personal friend, John Kennedy, and they're going into my state to ruin it. What am I going to do? All of my friends are going to say, who do we vote for? Obviously, the Catholic votes would go to Jack. West Florida people would vote for Johnson. And so he goes this whole back and forth thing. I came up with this great idea and said, I'll run as a favorite son, so neither one of you get Florida in your column. But Kennedy came to him and said, no. Like, you're my friend. You're on my side for this. Forget about Lyndon Johnson. And so it looks to me like Smathers was playing this kind of almost dirty double game in the background. I said, Kennedy got mad, and I said, well, I can't do it. I'm not going to do it. It went back and forth. Finally, he got mad and said, damn it to hell, what kind of friend are you? And so I said, look, I'm not going to stand here and take that kind of abuse. So I'm going to go out and I'm going to stand here. I'm leaving. I'm just sorry. If you're going to run, we're going to have a hell of a race. And that's all I can say. You'll have to run against me. So he's putting himself really, he's saying, I'm with Johnson there. And then he goes, they can go for whomever they want to vote for. I'll instruct my delegates, either for you or Lyndon. You've got Grant Stockdale, who will be on my slate. You've had him put out a slate already, and he loves you, as you know. He'll be making big speeches for you. So Now, this is interesting. As we get along in all this, people who've investigated Smathers have learned that he was doing things in the background to undermine Kennedy and his run for the White House, and even after he got in the White House. So Smathers shows up as a very unusual figure, and we have them, both Kennedy and Smathers sort of working with Stockdale in the middle between these two kind of powerful figures. Now, there's a book called The Many Lives of Marilyn Monroe from 2004. And what happens in here, and I want this to be really said clearly because we have a book that's been going around. This guy who wrote a convincing book about Dorothy Kilgallen is starting to spread these rumors about the Kennedys killing Marilyn. And this is one of those things that the CIA pumps up once in a while, and that they're very crafty with this message. And it's very important to get the history right on this. So what we've got is the CIA, which assassinated both Kennedys and probably were behind the assassination of Marilyn as well, love to spin the history and turn it back. So now you have this Netflix series come out based on some book that, Bobby kills Marilyn, or, this kind of thing. Isn't that just the thing, right? So you go and you eliminate two of the nation's leaders, and then 50 years later, you still can't get out from the shadow of that. So you put together the financing in the background, and then you make the entertainment industry support this delusion that, the Kennedys killed Marilyn, that you guys didn't kill the Kennedys. Hey. All right. Now, in that book, Many Lives of Marilyn Monroe, it was Smathers who first leaked to the press story of the affair with Marilyn. And the story first appeared in an article by Dorothy Kilgallen the day before Monroe died. Kilgallen was herself to die in similar circumstances in November of 1965. Now, this is interesting. We have to put this in context, too, because a lot of these stories that were going around in this period, the Marilyn thing, to have that knowledge that something big is going to happen with Marilyn, and to go behind the scenes to plant the story that Smathers plants of JFK's affair with Marilyn is, that's just the kind of deep state tactic to make Kennedy look bad and look responsible. This is part of the effort to take down President Kennedy. So these things that come up later, which are revisionist history that say, oh, well, the Kennedys, wanted to get Marilyn and snuff her out. Look, there's nothing. And I mean, in anything. The Kennedys did all kinds of deals in the background. Their dad did all kinds of deals and business things in the background and bootlegging. But there is nothing associated with murder with the Kennedys in the background. You're not going to find it. That wasn't the way that they operated. But the LBJ crowd, there's like a Clinton list of deaths involved with that. So, let's get the history right when we get to this. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Deep in this report, which is President Disclosure, 1963 to 2024. And as we started the program off, we may see another Kennedy headed for the White House, and that is RFK Jr. And the race may be, first to take out Stepford Biden at the ballot box, and then to face off Trump against RFK Jr. That would be an incredible and meaningful election. Unfortunately, the stranglehold that the Biden people have on the rules associated with the DNC have them moving the New Hampshire primary. And all the people of New Hampshire should revolt against that. And Biden should not be able to do that. When Biden ran in 2020, he got some of the lowest numbers ever for a presidential candidate in New Hampshire.
Deservedly so.
Yeah. And so they know him well, and they don't want to experience that if they go to run Stepford Biden over the finish line. They're going to get clobbered in New Hampshire. And if Kennedy wins in New Hampshire, and I know I'm future casting pretty fast here, but if he does, and I'm sure that he would, under the circumstances, that momentum may blow. They may see, Biden's finished, and Kennedy might step right into that leadership role. Now, they might do a number of things. They could try to run the crazy California governor, Newsom, etc. So these things may come up, but we're right in the middle of that situation. So when we go back to this piece of all of this, 1963, that's where the disclosure effort really has its roots. And the 2024 president, as I said, when he steps in, some kind of disclosure is going to come out of that situation. And this is what's crucial, because if it's CIA threat, UFO threat circus, Elizondo style disclosure, crazy Corbell disclosure, then, forget it. That whole thing will have been a waste. It'll just be a CIA story to fund a UFO DOE, that is UFO Defense Office, which Rubio and Gillibrand have already set up. However, if someone gets into that office, either Trump refreshed and aware of, all the hagglings of the deep state behind the scenes and becomes the disclosure president, or RFK Jr. steps up to the plate and overwhelms with the Kennedy machine, that whole Democratic lying machine, the race that the American people should be between Trump and RFK Jr. And there's a possible kind of unity between them anyway. As I said, there's some sort of relationship piece. I think that they both realize that Biden needs to fall. Okay. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, you're up.
I have to say, this is very interesting. We have a lot of new trolls in the chat tonight. And, I am watching them. I'm noting what they're saying and the energy they're bringing forth into the chat. And they're pretty damn obvious, I got to say.
Isn't that interesting? Well, if you really think about it, this is the launch of RFK Jr.'s campaign on this show, because he let it out. He didn't officially announce, but he said, basically, I'm in New Hampshire. They should change these rules. And yes, I got the okay from my wife to run. That's significant. In the background, I can tell you personally, I have heard that Bobby is running. So this is going to happen. Let's just get on with that right now. So the question is, can they stick to the New Hampshire? Can the people of New Hampshire make the DNC say, you cannot take our primary away? And if that happens and Bobby Kennedy is running, he's going to win. So, we could be looking at instant pushback in relation to that. What else you got?
Okay, so when you were talking about Stockdale, Robert Scott wanted to know, was Grant Stockdale any relation to Admiral Stockdale, Ross Perot's VP choice?
Well, what's interesting about that is, as far as I know, no, but Ross Perot is also in the Torbett document. And there's a suggestion.
You're kidding.
No. And there's a suggestion there that Perot and his, kind of looking for soldiers that are left behind in Vietnam, that when he goes back, he's reporting back to DISC, which is Defense Industrial Security Command, which is basically the actual UFO Defense Office that was run by Werner von Braun and was revealed by the Torbett document. So he's coming back to Ohio and giving reports to DISC. So what does that tell us about our friend Perot? It's pretty interesting, actually. And I think there's a couple of significant winks inside the 1992 campaign. One, I think the fact that Perot ran was significant. Two, the fact that he got out and got back in was also pretty wild. There's a big catchphrase there that everyone remembers from who are politicos, from Lloyd Benson against Dan Quayle. And the line is, I knew Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was a friend of mine, Senator. You know Jack Kennedy. Now, just the line that he's responding to is the fact that Quayle says, we're starting a new space council. We're going to Mars. And we're going to do all this stuff in space, just like Jack Kennedy was going to do. So he's saying, he's laying out weird space stuff. And then Benson is shooting down in this little. So if you go back, actually, the significance of that, if you watch the actual debate, is to go back and watch what Quayle says just before Benson drops the bomb. It's pretty wild. And of course, Kennedy comes right up there. So there's a lot of signaling going on in the background. I mentioned that's the same election where Lyndon LaRouche ran from prison. And I'm going to tell you,
Wow.
LaRouche is often dismissed as wild and crazy or whatever. One of the things that he was involved in was SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars. 1, 2, the guy talked openly about Atlantis, which I have to say is pretty interesting. And also that he ran and had the largest of any independent presidential operation, the largest donors, the largest effort and educational effort, you still find a lot of LaRouche people, frankly, and he's been dead for a while. So pretty interesting. I'm going to give you another weird fact since we're just talking presidential stuff. Did you know that in 1968, without actually running, that Ronald Reagan got more votes in the Republican primary than Richard Nixon?
Wow.
And Nixon actually was trailing behind Reagan's vote total in actual votes. And his name was entered in 1968, and he was tempted to step in, and he was warned off. I mean, it was very early for Reagan anyway, because he'd only been governor for 2 years, but he was already that popular. There's no, illusions about why he ran later and won. But it's very interesting because Nixon's forces warn him off and say, don't even think about it. And someone throws his hat in. And at a certain point, the next day, he goes up to the microphone and says, oh, I'm giving my support to President Nixon. So it's pretty interesting, though. If you go back, I've been looking at the 68 election because I think it was very telling. But those numbers, I have to tell you, I think are pretty remarkable and show we don't really know all what's going on. Because if you really think about it, if he was getting those types of numbers without actually running, he probably would have beaten Nixon very easily. And you would have had a Robert Kennedy, Ronald Reagan race, which is pretty interesting because they had done a debate only 3 or 4 months earlier about the American system, and that televised debate is still available, and it's pretty wild because it's the Gipper and RFK at his best. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, deep into the hot zone and the Disclosure president tonight. We'll be taking your questions here shortly. I'm going to do more on Stockdale and his mysterious death, and also the things that his family had to say about it. This person operating in the background on behalf of President Kennedy is a huge connection to the disclosure program that President Kennedy was working on. And I think that was the reason why he was eliminated, along with the fact that he understood who the players were. So he had to be eliminated quickly. And I can only imagine the shockwaves that sent through the Kennedy family, who, after all, he had been close to for over a decade. Okay. Let's get a couple more things on the record. By the way, speaking of Trump, this is a little aside. A couple of quick things. Trump to release $99 book of letters, including from President Nixon. Now, it's kind of interesting because some of the earliest X-series reporting were all about the letters of Trump and Nixon. And we indicated there was that whole history between the two. And there was a lot of pushback at the time. Oh, no, they had no relationship. It was one letter, blah, blah, blah. In 2020, of course, the Nixon Library revealed that there were hundreds of letters of correspondence. And of course, this is something that we put on the record early. And I want to get this across too, which is, there's a habit going on around the mainstream media of grabbing things from the independent media, not sourcing them, one, and two, getting it wrong and using it as a buzz thing. So what they've decided to do is kind of come down AstroTurf, kind of lift the information, run away with it, and then it doesn't actually change anything because it's just a fluff headline for one day. I think the thing that went on there with the whole CIA release of records and the kind of false meme that came out of that with the Tucker Carlson thing of like, oh, the CIA, it was proved, the files came out. And then Newsweek, think about how far Newsweek has fallen. By the way, Newsweek blocks Dark Journalist. Figure that one out. Must have been something I said. But it's interesting because if you think about it, they went on the record and they said, new records came out from a lawsuit by the Mary Farrell Foundation that show the CIA had this program of Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans and all this stuff. Now, Jefferson Morley, who was the former writer for the Washington Post who quit when they wouldn't run his JFK stories, he does a lot of things and he puts out a lot of good information around the JFK assassination. And he put out that we are taking a case to with the Mary Farrell Foundation to get the Biden administration to release these records. The case hadn't even hit, and actually only just recently hit. So there was no release of anything. I don't know what Tucker Carlson was thinking. I don't know what the media was thinking, and all the things that people were running around on Twitter and everything else. Nothing happened. There was literally no release of anything. And I can tell you, I watched the stuff very closely. Everyone was jumping up and down. Oh, CIA, we got these files. No, there were no files. They didn't release any of the files. When the December deadline came up, the files that came out weren't related to the CIA at all. They held back all the CIA files. So nothing came out is the upshot. So then right after that, on the heels of that, Tucker Carlson came out and said, oh, I've got the CIA whistleblower. He looked at all the records, and everyone was like, oh, it's out. All the records are out and everything is out. And these weird stories ran in Newsweek. The Mary Farrell Foundation had gotten these documents. They didn't get anything because the case, maybe someday they will, but they didn't get anything. I mean, that's the disappointment of all of it. This is the weird astroturfing I'm talking about. It's the same thing with the UFO file. They're talking about, it's kind of a false disclosure thing. You're not getting anything real from the Central Intelligence Agency. And if anything, they're on a course to convince you, oh, go to sleep about that. We've already taken care of it. We've got a UFO defense office, and the Kennedy records were released, which they weren't. Now, here's the real story. And you get this through our reporting on Dark Journalist. And I'm going to show you how the stuff gets hijacked here in a 2-minute comparison. We came forward with the story that, in the background, there were moves to have these records come out. Judge Napolitano was talking, and he was on 2 different podcasts. And he said, he recounted his story about talking to President Trump before he left office and said, why don't you release the JFK files? And Trump said, I can't do it. And Napolitano said, wait a minute, you promised you were going to do this. Don't treat the people like children. I mean, and he said, no, you don't understand. I've seen what's in those files. It can never come out. Do you understand? Like, that stuff can never come out. And Napolitano was, still on this thing of like, oh, you got to go get those files out. And finally, Trump just stopped him and said, Andrew, those files are never going to come out. So whatever it was that Trump saw in those files convinced him that those files could never come out. Now, I'm convinced that after years of people saying, well, there couldn't be anything definitive in those files after all, and, the CIA would have eliminated it. There is the story in the background of Robert Kennedy meeting with the CIA director immediately after the assassination at his farm in Virginia. And it could be that there's some mechanism that RFK left that they can't actually overwrite a particular record of their involvement. And that is what I think Trump had been looking at. And I think it relates directly to the UFO file. I think it relates to the Mar-a-Lago raid, and it relates to the classified document run, which now supposedly that classified document run has come from Mar-a-Lago and Trump. Now it's gone to Biden. And guess what? Biden supposedly taking documents from Delaware and sticking them at the JFK library. You figure that one out. Explain that one to me. Do you think we're on that story? Yes. Now, I'm not saying, this is the thing about the JFK library. They do a fantastic job. And, I don't think the records are there anymore, but just the fact that Biden made this move is very unusual. And I've said this before about the JFK library, that it's been used as a ping pong ball in the background. For example, during the Boston bombing, and I remember it well, during the Marathon bombing, there was an explosion at the JFK library during the exact same time as the explosion.
There was a fire. Was there an explosion? Or was it a fire?
There was a fire caused by an explosion.
Okay.
Yeah. And what happened was it happened in Copley Square that the Marathon bombings took place, and then an explosion and fire took place at the JFK library at exactly the same time, so that the local reports that were going on at the time came out and said, you know what, this is all related. This is another one of the incidents that's connected. Then they went and interviewed the director, who was coming out very hurriedly. And there was some local, Channel 4 NBC guy. And he's like, what's going on here? Like, and she's like, oh, no, nothing. It was just a small, little nothing. Didn't mean anything. And he asked his camera person to pan, and there was this gigantic black plume just covering Boston Harbor. So something very unusual was going on there. And we also know that the tapes themselves of Jackie Kennedy talking to William Manchester, the journalist, which were supposed to be stored at the library for 75 years, were prematurely going to be released as part of a deal with Carolyn Kennedy and ABC. And ABC was trying to air this miniseries, which was salacious and showing all this terrible stuff about, the Kennedys. And, it was a really ridiculous thing. And she was either like, well, I'm going to sue you, or we're going to make some kind of a deal. And so ABC made this deal, and they said, we'll get access to the records, your mother's tapes. And Jackie's tapes weren't supposed to come out until 75 years. That's 2038. So interestingly enough, there was a woman who was transcribing the tapes who leaked to an English newspaper what she was hearing. And it was all about Jackie saying that LBJ and the CIA were involved in the assassination. This was the kind of hot potato that was there. Now, there's been a lot of forces in the background trying to get control over the years over the Kennedy Library. And I think those tapes were originally why. Later, ABC aired edited tapes. They got a whole of edited tapes and said, oh, we don't know about, what that English newspaper said, but the person who was doing the transcription got fired. So that's the end of the transcriber. That's the end of the tape. What does the explosion mean? I mean, there's so many weird things that happened there. And, every year they sponsor very important talks, I think, at the library. The fact that they keep all of President Kennedy's belongings there and his whole history. And it's a great learning experience. Don't get me wrong. I'm not criticizing the library, but I think that in the background, it was a ping pong ball at one point in terms of the documents that were kept there. And I think that somehow the Biden thing, and he came up here, the part of the ruse was him meeting Prince William and Kate and this whole thing. So there's something, very odd about that whole set of circumstances. And then he came up here again. And right after that, and there was a whole thing about, his, 3 of his SUVs went on fire. I mean, so there was something odd in the air about Biden and the documents. So, I'm not saying that we have any conclusive answers on it, but there's something about this hot potato of classified documents running around. Mar-a-Lago, Pence. Remember at one point Pence was supposed to be raided. So there's some piece, and for my money, the only connection of that could be directly related to the UFO file. And it seems to me the original idea when Trump leaves office is that either he has something related to the JFK file and its association with the UFO file. It seems to me that's why they're looking through Melania's clothes, right? Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. We're going deep here tonight in this special report. We're taking your questions shortly. It's a great crowd out here tonight. We've introduced you to Grant Stockdale, and for sure, in programs that are coming up, we're going to be delving more into this very unusual insider aspect associated with President Kennedy and that arc, as we say, from 1963 to 2024, with the announcement that we could be looking at the potential of another Kennedy in the White House in 2024 election. So let's keep our fingers crossed on that and see what kind of important things we can bring forward on it. Okay, a couple of things came up, and this is again associated with what I was just talking about astroturfing wise, and I'm just going to round this out. Jefferson Morley wrote a fantastic book. It's called Scorpion's Dance. Jefferson Morley did all this kind of research in the background, and he found out that there was a tape that had been released, because there's this battle still over the tapes between the Nixon family and the National Archives, and the United States keeps taking them to the court. Oh, we want more of the tapes or whatever. So there's, everyone thinks, oh, we've heard all the Nixon tapes, whatever. No, the family has the majority of his tapes, but the government has, taken a lot of them. And there are dozens of court cases involved with this. And sometimes also people think they're getting transparency from the government when the tapes come out. The government ends up being the one who edits out tons of transcript from those tapes. So, nobody's getting I guess the Nixon family knows what's on the tapes, and that's it. But a little thing I want to kind of put on the record here. So Morley does all this work, and he finds this tape of basically Nixon trying to blackmail Helm by saying, I know, when we get around the CIA and the who shot John angle, I know how to protect you guys, suggesting that the Central Intelligence Agency was responsible for President Kennedy's assassination. That makes a lot of sense. And he puts out Nixon's plan to threaten the CIA on JFK's assassination. Now, we on our show make a report about this September and October. Somehow, in the midst of that weird astroturfing fury that I was talking about, this thing comes up, and then all these people are reporting on it. And unlike the reporting that we did in September and October, they don't credit Jefferson Morley with any of it. They just say, oh, a Watergate tape came out. Well, look, nobody had that tape. So I think it's, attribution is sort of fundamental to how you understand things. And it functions that way in any other thing. So for the media itself to run away with the story, and then people on the independent side of the alternative media to run away with this thing and say like, oh, Nixon was blackmailing Helms without giving the source of who came up through their own research with finding that tape is ludicrous. And, so we have to I want to say this for future understanding about the kind of environment that we want for alternative journalism, however you want to frame it, the dark journalism I'm talking about. But in that alternative research field, if it's just going to be for Twitter, headline stuff that somebody can run away with somebody's headline, that's not a very good way to do it, because even in high school, you learn attribution. And so, using that, I think fundamentally is very important. And especially when it comes to something as central as that. So, we had a researcher there, but it seemed like in that whole wave that the media wanted to follow up on these JFK stories. And, it's important for the JFK story to stay in the media, but the way that they're treating it, the sensationalizing it of the whole thing, trivializes it. And that's the danger. And it's the danger with the UFO file. That's where you get also on the other side with the whole Corbell Knapp, weaponize and all that stuff. That's all fluff. It has nothing to do with the actual UFO file piece. That's all the CIA UFO gobbledygook threat narrative stuff that they're trying to push for. That's a financial marketing push, and it's a intelligence narrative push. And real journalism doesn't have to have anything to do with any of it. We were looking now, the DOJ just came out with something, and they were going back to Twitter after all those Twitter files came out. And by the way, I thought most of the releases around the Twitter files were pretty lightweight. It's good. The theme of it is good, of them getting to the bottom of some of those Twitter officials who were setting up conservatives and all the rest of it. But they don't go nearly as deep as they promised to go at all. And they're making it like, oh, this is this great declaration, of freedom and democracy. Well, I think that they hid basically about 85% of the important stuff. But anyway, they came out with that. Even with that little piece that got shared through the Twitter files, the DOJ went to Twitter and asked them for names of journalists who were involved in getting those Twitter files. The Justice Department should have nothing to do with that. So, those are real fascist moves around journalism, as is the domestic terror bill, and trying to limit what people can and cannot say. So we have to be very aware of these things going into this, 2023, 2024 election season, because, it's a real dangerous precipice, especially with a desperate administration on the top who can only function through emergency powers. Okay. Miss Olivia, how you doing back there?
Karen Carpenter wanted to know, are there Hemingway records or belongings at the Kennedy Library? And David Tormina says, DJ, isn't it possible that RFK Jr. would have access to these time capsule files?
Well, the first thing is, of course, the largest repository of any Ernest Hemingway information is at the Kennedy Library. And they've been very generous with the access to it. However, there are things there that you if you go and review them for the library, you have to make an appointment to see them, and they can't be removed from the library and stuff. Those are just rules that they came up with. But there's so much more in relation to the JFK Hemingway piece. I think the kind of repository of his records and his writings and things being at the Kennedy Library speaks to that deeper hot zone relationship that JFK and Hemingway had. And I don't expect that there's anything at the library that's going to be too explosive, but I think the actual relationship between Hemingway and Kennedy is revealed in that fact that the largest repository for any information on Ernest Hemingway is right out there at the JFK Library. How does that work? If you know history, you know history. This is the way I look at it. Okay. Back to some very, very interesting people in the hot zone around the Smathers, Stockdale, and Kennedy piece. We'll do this for about another 15 minutes or so, and then we'll take your questions. How's that? Okay,
sounds great.
Good. You're watching the Dark Journalist Show, everyone. This is the special report that we're doing, the Disclosure President X. And it's 1963 on one side, that effort by President Kennedy to move the culture forward by sharing this with the Russians to avoid a nuclear incident and to explore space together, versus what we got and what we're moving into for 2024, which is either completely false disclosure brought to you by the Central Intelligence Agency and Homeland Security versus something else that's happening in the background. And in terms of RFK Jr., we have to say something quite remarkable in the idea of him running against Biden and showing up that entire system. Let's see if we get there. Okay. I have to bring up kind of this is kind of a sad part of it. The whole story, I suppose, is sad. Let's get again oriented around this. Now, Smathers, 6 days before the assassination, accompanies President Kennedy to Florida. He's the senator there, and he accompanies him to NASA. And there they are. And they actually meet with von Braun, which I have a shot of that as well. And von Braun is there showing them these different advances that they're making towards Apollo. And of course, the whole big push at the time is around the Mighty Moon mission. And we have Paperclip Nazi there. But what's always been more interesting to me and for researchers around the JFK assassination is his boss, Walter Dornberger, who's the rocket scientist that we brought over at the insistence of von Braun and who became the VP of Bell Helicopter and Bell Aerospace. And the person who was his protege at Bell Helicopter was Michael Payne, who Lee Harvey Oswald was staying with the Paynes. And so we have these connections, and they're well organized by researchers now at this point. However, the traditional trajectory, when people look at the Kennedy assassination, there's all this stuff about the mafia or Cuban, all that kind of thing. Look, the assassination was accomplished by two groups, the intelligence aspect working with the aerospace aspect. That's where the action was in relation to that. And we've tried to put that forward. We did a documentary called Aerospace Assassins that gave some of that. But more is coming out, and certainly if we get the rest of the records involved, it'll outline that relationship quite well, as does the idea that we're looking at the UFO file disclosure aspect and the way that it's being released. If we got the true story about what's been taking place there, we would find that President Kennedy was a casualty of that battle going on in the background between the X-Share group, which is trying to share the UFO file with the culture to move it forward, and the X-Protect group, which uses a variety of means to keep that wall of secrecy in place and is now looking to make the secrecy more secure by putting out a false narrative of the entire story. That's where we're stuck at with UFO DOE, the UFO Defense Office. Yes, UFO DOE, Rubio and Gillibrand. That's not the official name, of course, but they do say it's a UFO Defense Office. So there you go. And that the name that they're using for it is Arrow. And the last thing I'll say about that, which I think is significant, is that they've attached it to the National Defense Authorization Act. So that means anytime money comes up, that huge boondoggle that comes up at the end of every year for $800 billion to the military. By the way, last time I checked, we weren't involved in any wars except the stupid thing that they're trying to get us into in Ukraine. So against Russia. So that $800 billion is a boondoggle for Boeing, Lockheed, and all the rest of it. Well, every person in Congress unanimously waves that thing through every year. However, the way that it was attached with Gillibrand and Rubio this time around required that there be a UFO Defense Office, Arrow, involved in there. And that if it didn't, they would hold up the entire bill. So you can see all those people, in all those agencies waiting for all that good $800 billion to floor. And it's being held up by these two senators who are saying, no, you got to include the UFO thing. So that's how you get the false UFO threat narrative going. And that's how you get it funded, et cetera. Yes, what do you got?
No, it's not a good time.
Oh, you got it. All right. When Olivia's making signals like that, something's going on in the chat. All right. So I mentioned the fact, then let's recapture the Grant Stockdale piece. So the assassination happens and he goes to the funeral. And I have the telegram that RFK sent to him inviting him to the funeral. And then he goes and he has this secret meeting, which is kept off the books for 30 years, with Bobby Kennedy and Ted Kennedy. And he comes back frustrated and says to his wife, I can't believe they're not doing more about this. But she's very kind of freaked out about the entire thing. Now, the son, Lee Stockdale, was 12 years old at the time, remembers all the things that his mother told him, etc. As I mentioned, he did a series of articles talking about his dad. Okay, so in 2010, he puts out this 3-part series with a local newspaper in Florida. So I'm just going to read some selections from Lee Stockdale, who's an attorney, the son of Grant Stockdale, who was pushed out of a window in Miami 10 days after the assassination and who was a very good friend of President Kennedy's. President Kennedy was a speed reader and read everything in sight. Once in a while, spending the night with us, he read a bunch of Mom's poems in the guest room and was favorably impressed. When Dad got back from his trip out west with JFK, he told Mom that the president said he wanted her to write a book on poetry for Ireland. So Mom got started. I mentioned this book, To Ireland with Love. But that just kind of shows that friendly, tightness of the whole thing that they had with President Kennedy. President Kennedy learned that Russia was stationing missiles in Cuba, 90 miles from the United States, precipitating the Cuban Missile Crisis. The two great superpowers were on the brink of nuclear war. Sound familiar? During the 13 days in October, the president called Dad at home one night and told Dad he wanted him to go down that very moment to Homestead Air Force Base. Now, this is interesting. Homestead is where not only supposedly they keep alien artifacts, from crashes, but also bodies. This is supposedly where Jackie Gleason showed, or Richard Nixon showed Jackie Gleason dead bodies. Now, he wants him to go there and report back to him what was going on. Jack told Dad he wanted to confirm whether bombs were being loaded onto the B-52s. He told Dad, I want you to put your hands on the bombs. I started off with that. Dad and my big brother, Grant Jr., then 16, got in the car and went down to Homestead. Grant told me the military appeared to expect Dad, and he was waved through all the checkpoints. Dad walked to the tarmac of the flight line and literally put his hands on one of the bombs being loaded as the president directed. Dad came back immediately, called the president, and told him that, yes, the bombs were being loaded. Ultimately, JFK diffused the Cuban Missile Crisis through diplomacy. Gee, remember diplomacy? That's how they used to avoid wars. Now it's just, hey, give Zelensky hundreds of billions of dollars and, he's trying to get himself on the Academy Awards. Did I tell you that? That even the Academy Awards are barking at Zelensky. He's trying to get himself to be like a keynote speaker for the Oscars. Get out of here. We don't want your war, and we don't want to feed all this money in. And if anything, we just want to help the people of Ukraine. And probably the best way to do that is to get you out of there. All right. On January 1st, 1963, a happy President Kennedy joined Dad and other Florida politicians to watch Alabama beat Oklahoma in the Orange Bowl. And Dad saw the chief, that's JFK, in Washington and Palm Beach throughout 1963. Dad told Mom after one visit to Palm Beach that he and JFK walked out to the ocean and the president was given a prototype military rifle to test fire into the Atlantic. So what happens is, in the middle of all this, JFK says, I want you to bring $50,000 to the White House. I want you to raise it, and I want you to bring it to the White House. The president asked Dad to bring $50,000 cash to him in Palm Beach next week. JFK assumed that Dad would raise the money from friends and political supporters, but made it clear that he, the president, would never be able to acknowledge receipt of the funds. Now, you can imagine the shock of this from him and also from his wife and stuff, because JFK is, he's a millionaire then, but for us, he's a billionaire. So they're like, what is this about $50,000 raising this money? Some kind of political thing. Mom was livid that Jack, a millionaire, would come to Dad and ask him for the money free and clear, but Dad raised the money and took it up to Palm Beach, as was later confirmed with a friend of Dad's who went with him. When Dad visited the president in Washington, they have a whole thing there about what happened. Now, this is interesting. In a story by Seymour Hersh, and Seymour Hersh, when he went to take on the Kennedys, he's this award-winning journalist who recently reported on the Nordstrom bombing. So, but he's been around for years, from all the way back to Vietnam, and he's done this incredible work. Interestingly enough, Professor Scott is very aware of him and said that he was doing great work. And at a certain point, the Central Intelligence Agency said, you don't have to work so hard. If you let us have some input in the projects that you're doing, I'll give you like these great details. And that was the time when he was writing the Kennedy book, which is why the Kennedy book, The Dark Side of Camelot, is so anti-Kennedy and pro-CIA. Nonetheless, in there is an interesting story about Judith Campbell Exner. Now, there's a whole thing. We did an episode called Female Targets from December, which went completely into that relationship and Sam Giancana and all the unusualness about this, Frank Sinatra setting up JFK with Judith Campbell Exner, who's this beautiful Hollywood actress and
sexy.
She's remarkable. And she came out and told her story later, probably thinking she was going to get bumped off because of all the things that she knew. And interestingly enough, in there, she talks about Kennedy giving money and feeding money in the background to different people in Las Vegas. Now, what I believe was taking place was that the CIA behind Kennedy's back were trying to assassinate Castro and use the mafia to do it. And Kennedy in the background was paying them, one, not to participate in anything like that, and two, to give him all the information that the CIA was giving to them about how they should do the assassination. Now, this is part of the backdoor piece of this money going on in the background. And one of the interesting things that comes up, and it's in the episode, explored very deeply, and I won't get into all of it here, I'll just give you about 2 minutes of it, is that Judith, on a number of these excursions back and forth, Kennedy directs her to meet with a couple of interesting military people. And they're contractors working on an secret aerospace design, and he's giving them money, and they are sending him back blueprints. Now, this is where the disclosure piece comes in, because I think Kennedy, again, just like he was working behind the scenes to get messages to Khrushchev and behind the scenes to get messages to Castro and going around the State Department and the deep state, that he was going directly to the people who were reverse engineering the UFO file, and that he was getting what they were developed up to so that the CIA couldn't lie to him about it the way they had lied to Eisenhower. And there's a lot to support this particular idea. But when I see him asking this person to raise $50,000 kind of off the books, again, it rings that bell in the back of my mind. This is what that money was for. And this is how it was circulated without ever it coming directly out of JFK's political money or from his own incredible bank account. All right. A little more from the background of our friend Stockdale and the little window between President Kennedy's assassination and then him jumping out a window, being pushed. In fact, everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is Disclosure President, 1963 to 2024. We're going to be taking your questions here shortly. Okay. November 22nd, 1963, Dad came home from the office. As soon as he heard about the assassination, he repeated, "They shot him down like a dog." We watched the Huntley-Brinkley report all afternoon. A telegram came from Bobby Kennedy inviting Dad to the White House the next day, Saturday, to view the president's body. Dad flew up to the White House, met with Bobby and Teddy, flew home, and then went back the next day for the funeral. JFK was buried on Monday, November 25th. My father would be dead the following Monday. In those intervening 7 days, Dad told my mother, quote, he was being followed. He thought by FBI agents. 2 days before he died, Dad told a close friend that FBI agents had come to his office and asked him, among other things, what Dad had been doing in New Orleans. New Orleans was where Lee Harvey Oswald had been living and handing out Fair Play for Cuba leaflets on street corners. Of course, we know he was actually working for Guy Bannister, who was in charge of the UFO file and was a hardcore right-winger. So that doesn't make anything, there's no sort of historical sense of Lee Harvey Oswald working for him, considering Oswald was supposed to be this arch communist. So that doesn't add up. So therefore, the story about Oswald as a communist is just a cover that Bannister gave him. Okay. Little else was known about Oswald in those first few days. Dad, astonished by the agent's inquiries, told them he was in New Orleans attending a Professional Golf Association event. Mom told us that the night before Dad died, he told her people were out to get him. Interesting. December 2nd, 1963, the principal of the Coral Gables Elementary came to my 6th grade class and asked me to come to the office, and he basically gives them the terrible news. A neighborhood family friend took Susie and me out to dinner and stopped to buy shoes. I saw a newspaper that said ex-envoy Stockdale plunges 13 stories to death. My brother and sisters came home for Dad's funeral. Now, this is what's interesting. So the family comes back, and when they leave, just a few days later, the house is broken into, the house where he lives and his mother lives. Just a few days later, our house was broken into. Anne was asleep downstairs. At about 3 a.m., Anne was awakened by the sound of the shutters being jimmied. Anne is his sister. That meant somebody was inside. She quickly flicked on and off the light. The man was sticking his hand through the window. She dashed upstairs. Mom called the police, who arrived immediately. We were terrified. We walked through the house with the police. Whoever was at Anne's window had already been inside the house. Remember, this is after Grant has jumped off and been pushed off through the window. The intruder had carefully pried open the dining room window, set the screen on the side, and walked around the house. There on the dining room table, the intruder positioned a machete. 4 or 5 knives were arranged on the kitchen counter. Amazing. Nothing was taken. There was cash in plain view for the housekeeper coming the next day. None of it was touched. Finally, the police left, assuring us we were safe. We huddled at the bottom of the stairs, retracing what had just happened. Minutes after the police left, the phone rang. Mom answered. A man's voice said, "I hear you've had some trouble tonight." Mom thought it was some official. She said, "Yes, the police just left." The man repeated flatly, "I hear you've had some trouble tonight." Mom said, "Who is this?" The man said, "I'm going to get your daughter." And he hung up. Police came back to the house. Mom gave a report of the phone call. Annie was hardly put on a plane the next day. Mom changed all the locks and put deadbolts everywhere. Mom, Susie, and I changed our sleeping arrangements, and so on it goes. The central question for the family has always been whether Dad committed suicide or whether someone killed him. When Dad told Mom he was being followed by FBI agents, who were they? Was Dad, when Dad told Mom people were out to get him. Were people out to get him? Did they get him? And why did they threaten us? If someone did kill Dad, who did it? Why? Over the years, the family has been contacted by a number of journalists, and so on it goes. Well, Stockdale was in the middle of this machine of Smathers and the assassination attempt to get Kennedy, which was successful. And somehow that machine, which involved on some level Baker and LBJ and the CIA, definitely realized that they had someone operating there who knew too much, and they had to eliminate him. But then the question must have come up, how much had he told his wife? And that's where you get the threats after the fact. So you get the actual death of President Kennedy, then the death of the friend, his close friend Stockdale, and then the threats to the wife. And then basically the story retreats into history. But what we have is tons of aerospace connections around the Florida coast, Smathers, the CIA, Smathers' obsession with assassinating Castro, and the strange death mimicking the death of Secretary Forrestal. Absolutely unbelievable. And there's more. But what I'm going to do here, I'm going to insert more as we go along. I'm going to turn it all over to you, Miss Olivia, for your questions.
Okay, this is slightly off topic, but we're going to go
not
there.
Not good. Not good.
Well, it's Joseph.
Okay.
So I'm gonna start with him.
Okay.
Okay. So Giza Death Star community. There has to be something specific in the UFO file keeping this secret. Is it that ET contact was occult/demonic in nature? That there is a covert ET contact group that discovered they were dealing with demons beyond just UFOs existing and recovered bodies?
Wow, that's absolutely fascinating. It's totally related.
Okay.
Completely. I mean, the whole point is that, thank you for the question. I think it is in great context. Thank you. Well, Joseph is right on there. Think about it, because it is relating to some aspect which is not just as obvious. And I say this sometimes about apotheum, because when we get into it, hiding the UFO file the way that they do. And by the way, what about UFO espionage? All right. We've had atomic espionage. We've had nuclear espionage. Where's the really good, hard reporting on UFO espionage? This will take us actually into the Reagan aspect of this. And I think there's an event that really can be dissected and looked back upon and examined in such a way that we get an idea of just how UFO espionage works. But that is really what it comes down to, that it seems the secrecy level is beyond something that would just be, oh, there's something else flying in our space with us. That is, it's certainly heavy duty. But the idea of apotheum is the effects that come with the visitations. That is, some of the stories, as we know, defy physics in any kind of logical sense. And I've talked to some of those contactees over the years. And I remember John Mack, of course, when I was in college, my friend worked for him. And the things that she told me was that he was training people to use astral travel to prevent them from being abducted. Well, that's kind of, even at the time, I was like, this is extraordinary. But I find that interesting because, a lot of them were getting lifted up and lifted through walls. And you'll find that throughout the UFO phenomena. So how do you change all the physics to do something like that? So residing inside of that UFO file X technology piece is this apotheum, these physics that are just, disruption of reality physics and universal norms. This, for me, gets to a really kind of hardcore piece around it. But yeah, that becomes an interesting preponderance of the whole thing. Yes. What do you
Karen
got?
Carpenter, would this tie into why the people in power are so corrupt and seem to have evil agendas?
Well, I mean, anytime you're dealing with a secret, whether it's a financial one, a military one, or what have you, you bring out this kind of lower nature. And I think politics in particular with this power dynamic, brings out this lower nature. But the question is, what kind of a government do we want? And, what kind of a world do we want? What kind of society? What kind of culture? And it's not that I think we can eliminate those types or anything like that. It's just that the kind of overwhelming balance at this point is on the side of this predator class. So the problem with it, I think, in the background is some of the things that we get into in studying the mystery schools, et cetera, is that there's a force driving that. So in a sense, you're very much on the money with that. But I don't think that, it's an interesting thing, because it's not that the society has to be perfect or we're demanding this kind of, it's just that there has to be a fundamental ethic operating on the leadership level, because if the disconnect is so kind of, schizophrenic between the public on the ground and what they know versus this other group running away and thinking, oh, we're gods and we can use this alien technology to control everyone on the ground. I go back very often. If you study the early space program by the Nazis, you're going to find that basically the idea was going to control things on Earth from space, and that this graduated over time and became the mission, of the space program, by every group and not just the American group. So this is a really major problem. And I think President Kennedy saw this at the outset and said, this is what we'll do. We'll have joint moon missions. There'll be no war in space. We'll make space a science zone of exploration, and we'll ban weapons in space. So these people who were all counting on that program that they were developing must have looked at him and said, forget it. This guy who thinks that he can change the entire world with this, ethical vision of how we should handle space. And by the way, not only that, but he wants people to have the same opportunities that he did so that they can become part of our class also. Get rid of this guy. He actually believes his own speeches, and I think that this is part of the issue. What's the problem with assassination research is that they don't keep in mind who Kennedy was enough, and the innovation of Kennedy. This is something Mikhail Gorbachev said when he went to the Texas School Book Depository, which is a very strange thing for him to do, to go to the place where supposedly Oswald had assassinated President Kennedy. We all know that that is completely false. But I think it's a statement that when Gorbachev goes there, he's saying, I know what took place. But what he says is interesting. He says Kennedy was so far, his vision of what humanity should get from its government was so far advanced, we're still catching up to him. And, Gorbachev said that before he died. I think that this is the interesting thing about Kennedy. Somehow he had a vision of how all this could work together. And that's why at a crucial point in our history, he backed us off the most amazing, possibility of destruction, nuclear destruction with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Someone else in there, Nixon or somebody, would have been kissing up to the military, and we'd be looking at, a refried Cuba and, all of the terrible things that come with that. So to change the timeline like that, I think, is an extraordinary accomplishment. And so when we look at Kennedy, there is this kind of mythical aspect to him, in a sense. There is that Camelot piece. But he's also a human being operating with the best intelligence that he can get, and he's applying it. He's applying himself to the position. So instead, of the kind of things that we get with, the CIA thing, like, oh, the Kennedys killed Marilyn, this kind of thing. We need to look to the incredible accomplishments and see that CIA machine is still trying to destroy. Because in a sense, their own authority is ultimately undermined because the American public, even after 60 years, never fully swallowed that story. Yes.
Najat Madri, if the UFO secret is demonic, would it trigger some kind of apocalyptic end of times response from extreme religious groups? And that's another fear of disclosure?
Well, I don't see it that way. I think that they've studied this idea that, there's already in hardcore extreme religious circles, the idea of, oh, UFOs as demons. And I remember very well talking with some Christians who, wanted me to be a guest on their show and all this stuff. And, they were talking, and they were very nice people. And I actually was on their show a few times, but at a certain point I said to them, the whole idea that you're doing about UFOs as demons, it's very limiting, because, you know, you have to understand, if you are a pilot, let's take Gordon Cooper, for example. Gordon Cooper wasn't applying any religion when he was flying around out there. Something was flying with him and started to follow his formation. So something technological was working to intimidate him up there or play with him or whatever. So I don't think that has anything to do with any religious anything. I think it's something that is already operating on a technological level that was above what we had. And so we have this aspect. Now, that aspect can be a leftover from a time when we had this technology on Earth. We've talked about this Ezekiel, Atlantean, Casey reading. It could be certainly an accomplishment taken on by the mystery schools and kept, that high technology. It could be something here for sure. It could be an off-world visitor from another system who's coming here to check things out. So there's a lot of possibilities, and none of them have anything to do with demons on that level. Now, when you get into other pieces, of what humanity is supposed to give fealty to and things of this nature, and when you get into the whole alien gods thing and Anunnaki and that kind of piece, then you're getting into, something direct along this line. So, so in a sense, both things coexist, and getting to the bottom of them is very hard. And that's why I think such good attention needs to be paid to actual research dealing with the UFO file that has something to do with the experiences that people have on the ground, so we get a sense for what it is that we're talking about. UFO file research is very, very different than this thing that they've been putting out, the kind of sick, what are they, weaponized, and the CIA, there's a sick thing there about, they're performing things, and there's a lot of lies involved. We have a lot of pilots now saying air safety is under attack. I mean, we've been dealing with UFOs for a long time. I mean, a lot of our commercial craft, we've seen UFOs and we've seen weird things happen, but it's hardly the idea that UFOs are out there trying to take down our aircraft. So their whole thing, in that sense, is just a threat. That's how they adopt things. That's how they get money. That's how they get control. And the UFO threat, with its emergency powers COG piece, becomes then, I think, the ultimate holy grail for these people, because as time goes on here, less and less do they have the ability to govern by an actual majority. And, their numbers are slight. Justin Trudeau's numbers, 27% approval. How could you go on as a leader like that? So, he needs to press the button for the truckers like he did last year. Stepford Biden is going to need some emergency, because he's not looking good to, they can't pull his corpse across the election line next year. I don't buy it, So we're looking at something, I think, where emergency powers becomes the holy grail for, the Davos crowd, the Central Intelligence Agency, and the rest of it. And the UFO file, they've been developing that one for a long time. So I've said it before, if you think the COVID piece was dramatic with the lockdowns and stay in your house and your relatives are your enemies and all that stuff, just wait till they launch that UFO file on you. Yes.
Okay, Don Neway, former Israeli space security chief, says extraterrestrials exist and Trump knows about it. And Jimmy Lyle Kennemer, DJ, do you think Trump will allow UFO disclosure, having said what he said about the JFK file?
Yeah, you made me think about that. Look, there's a lot with Trump, and the former Israeli space chief did say, well, the aliens were in touch with Trump, and Trump was actually going to release information. They got in touch with him and said, no, don't disclose it yet. Your culture's not ready. That was the story that he put out. Now, look, this guy has incredible, and I mean incredible, credentials. I think his name is Haim Rashid. And Trump let out some very unusual things about the UFO file as well while he was president. Of course, Trump says he's heard very, very interesting things about Roswell. What did you hear, Trump? And why are you talking about that with your son? I mean, it's unusual. Trump's uncle, of course, as we've gone over on this program many times, John Trump, was the protege of Vannevar Bush, who was in charge of the UFO file. Now, the top physicist, Robert Sarbarker, one of the top physicists in America in the 40s and 50s, gave us that information. Not an MJ-12 document, not something that somebody thought of, not the testimony of, William Cooper or someone, but this is a physicist who worked on the UFO file. And he said, well, Vannevar Bush was in charge with it. He was the guy who was doing this. And then he said, then it went from him, and he named the lineage of it. And so we have that information, therefore, that John Trump was Vannevar Bush's protege. So therefore, John Trump is plugged in to the secrecy around the UFO file, but also the knowledge of the UFO file. So according to President Trump, he was very close with his uncle, and his uncle shared things with him and said, oh, my uncle talked about nuclear long before there was nuclear. So how much of a stretch is it to say the uncle told him about the UFO file? So for me, there's a lot there that's just wide open. And Trump is at the heart of the UFO file. Look, let's get beyond just the rhetoric of, Trump doing mean tweets and all that stuff. What causes this entire establishment that you have to peel them off the ceiling when President Trump got in office, and that they spent all their time trying to take him out of office? Now, whether you love Trump or not, it doesn't matter. Or, you can feel any way you want about him. Why that response? I have never, ever seen that response on a presidential level. And I've been watching, I've been interested in presidential politics for a long time. I've never seen anything like that. But I bet people who were around in Kennedy's era found that deep state operation, there were always those posters about Kennedy as a traitor and all that kind of stuff. Look, there's always a little animosity about one party that hates the other guy, and all the rest of it. But with Trump, it's absolutely, we have to get rid of this person. So that tells me that Trump has something. He knows too many of where the bodies are buried in relation to those key entry points of the deep state. And I think, as we've discussed before with Dr. Joseph Farrell, probably Roy Cohn, coming, by the way, who's also in that Torbett document along with Grant Stockdale, he, is directly involved in that aerospace, secret aerospace aspect there, is involved on that deep state level for decades, and then becomes Trump's political mentor. That has to tell us something about where Trump is coming from. So Trump goes in with the same level of knowledge as these people, and, they're just like, oh, he's a misogynist, he's a racist, he's all these different things. Look, he's competition. And those people don't anticipate on that level competition. So that's the real problem they have with Trump. And so that's why 2024 couldn't get more interesting. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, going deep in the special report tonight. Great to be with all of you. Of course, I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com to sign up for our free newsletter that keeps us in touch. We've experienced remarkable censorship. And I've had a lot of tech people, because I ran a tech magazine after all for a number of years. And I've had a lot of them look at how we get shadow banned and all the rest of it. And let me tell you, they de-amplify the things that we're doing a heck of a lot, which is why we need to really rely on that one-on-one pipeline that we can get through the newsletter. So go to darkjournalist.com and sign up basically you get an email once a week letting you know about the incredible, and I mean incredible, interviews that we have coming up for you, and X series episodes. And of course, most important of all, the 5-year anniversary two-parter, March 24th and 25th at 8 p.m. Friday and Saturday. 2 weeks, I think,
Mhm.
basically. And Miss Olivia, you'll be up for that.
Yep.
But that's going to be fantastic. So make sure you stand up and be counted, and you're on that newsletter list. You're up.
Joseph also added to what you were saying before, is not to mention the UFO connection to McCarthy.
Absolutely. And here's why we need to maybe redraw the UFO field, because the information about McCarthy wasn't, Joseph brought that out. So the whole Blue Book connection with McCarthy in the Monmouth hearings, and that Roy Cohn was associated with that, trying to get information on the UFO incident in Roswell and all the rest. You know, basically the UFO field took off on this one track, and I think we got some things out of it, but it ran out of steam and the CIA took over, and they took over the broke researchers that were involved with it, and it put stars in their eyes so that they all started talking about, weaponized and all this weird stuff, and Tom DeLonge and all this nonsense. So that's the thing that we're stuck with in the field. But UFO file research is still there. It's still rich. The people's experiences, the things that happened, there's decades of it. And we are right positioned here in the ideas room to get at the core of that. So the entire field needs to be redrawn with that information about McCarthy, the things we've brought forward about the UFO file here. Hey, how about this? Douglas Caddy, the Watergate lawyer, came on this program, what, 5 or 6 years ago, and said that Howard Hunt told him in private that Kennedy was eliminated over the UFO file. Well, that's probably the top official, who said that the CIA, he's somebody in a position to know that this had happened. And being a Watergate lawyer, as Caddy was, he's a historical figure who's giving us this information. And the UFO field is like, hey, Lou Elizondo photographed a UFO outside of his house. I mean, I don't know what that group is about. It's funny, the people who follow that stuff are going over a cliff, because there's nothing at the end of that rainbow except some kind of a War Department, and the intelligence agencies using the war thing as a emergency security risk. They're going over the cliff with the UFO threat piece. So there's a totally different field emerging in the middle of all this research, and it's sending ripples and repercussions everywhere, so much so that I can tell you that when I'm looking and perusing through mainstream media, I see so many of the X series themes out there that if you looked 5 years ago when we started this program, they weren't there at all. So they found the need to co-opt the issues and just spin them their way, because if people get the real thing, for me, that's the real reason they're afraid of conversations like the ones that we're having here, and why there was all this, we need to ban these people. If you mention one word about such and such, you're out, or in the words of the Twitter files, you're de-amplified. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means you can put out all the stuff that you want to, but it won't reach anybody because the algorithm says, oh, he's talking about the UFO file, block. So, that's the nature of the thing that we're up against. But look, they did it to RFK Jr. when he was talking about ivermectin and things of this nature. So, who am I to complain? Go for it.
Joseph says ufology misses every important story, and I think the big names do it deliberately.
No question. And not only that, but I can tell you that people in that field who I've talked to personally, relating things like this to them, they're in a weird haze of that field that has something to do with, Gary Nolan, who is a CIA, professor at Stanford, who's good friends and high-fiving Anthony Fauci online. That you want that for UFO disclosure, Fauci disclosure. They're in that whole weird haze. Elizondo's come down significantly. I think even the group inside is trying to promote people like Nolan and Corbell to try to get past Elizondo, because Elizondo did such a weird job insulting people and such, and really taking every position possible. But weird things are coming out. For example, about Bob Lazar's first wife, um, and murder charges and things like that. So, it's a problem because this whole thing, the UFO field has been built on a series of marketing moves and central intelligence meanderings. And then the CIA just swallowed that thing whole. So that's what they're trying to move with. In the middle are, as I said, the real experiences. And we have decades of those experiences. Now, a lot of people who've had those experiences have passed it down family wise. So it's a generational thing. That people have. So we have that. That's the real UFO file research, and we have people who can do it. So forget about the fluff part. But I think it's dangerous. Interestingly enough, John Warner, of course, knows a great deal about the UFO file because his dad was part of the Magic group, after all, as the head of the Navy and a senator for Virginia for many years. Even he was saying, look, like all these people are running around on that UFO thing, and they're saying, they're kind of attributing all these qualities and being like, oh, it's so great that Elizondo and Knapp, and I mean, it's pretty bad, and I think that even somebody who has as much knowledge as he does gets a little disgusted when looking at that, and they're like, well, why should I even bother bringing this important information out? Look, John Warner is a Mellon, all right? His cousin is Chris Mellon, who's trying to help launch the UFO threat piece, okay? So you've got somebody right in the middle of that whole thing, whose dad was the head of the Navy and a senator for decades, operating in Antarctica and stuff like that, okay? How about we probably should be listening more to those voices? How about that instead of, Sean Cahill and blowhard Elizondo and crooked Gary Nolan with Dr. Fauci and all that, so that field, and the people that are inside of it, the only problem that I really have, they can do all the weird nonsense that they want to do. My only problem is that the mainstream media who are trying to get into it, and I've mentioned this before, they go to that end of the pool, probably by design, but nonetheless, either that or they don't know anything about like a guy like Tucker Carlson doesn't really know anything about the UFO file. So what is he doing? He's fishing in the CIA pond. And these CIA people are saying, oh, it's a threat. How dare we see this threat? Well, you'd be better off with no disclosure versus CIA phony disclosure. I can tell you that, because the CIA disclosure, look, the Central Intelligence Agency, the job of the group is to deceive people. I can't stress that enough. All you have to do is look at the history. When you look at things like the Pentagon Papers, one of the first big releases about anything. When you look at the history of Church Committee in the 70s, what did they discover about the atrocities of the Central Intelligence Agency? What happened to the Central Intelligence Agency? It grew and grew and grew. And then it was joined by Homeland Security. And what happened to Homeland Security? It grew and grew and grew. And so now you have 250,000 employees at Homeland Security. My God, we didn't even have Homeland Security 20 years ago. So this is the gauntlet that they're doing. How much money does it take, by the way, to have 250,000 employees? That's a hell of a lot of the federal budget. Okay. It's enough of that. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show Europe.
Okay, David Tormina. DJ, JFK awarded Vannevar Bush the National Science Award that he created, and it said that JFK rescued his career. Isn't it possible that JFK was debriefed by Bush himself?
Bush debriefed every president on the UFO file, and from Roosevelt on. So no question he did. And I have a picture of Vannevar Bush, like looking, I think he was like 90 something years old at this point. And there he is with Nixon. And that's 1971. So forget it. I mean, this guy, how many presidents is that he's briefing on this topic? So Vannevar Bush is the key figure in all this. But the interesting thing about Vannevar Bush, and it's interesting because they still have the MIT Masonic Lodge, and he was the Grand Master of that lodge, and he adopted the secrecy that the Masons had to the UFO file and also to the wartime effort to develop the bomb. So those people under his watch, like John Trump, understood secrecy very well. And of course, it is John Trump who gets sent in by Vannevar Bush to explore Tesla's last belongings, looking for death ray information. And what did the agents actually ask our friend John Trump to look for? They said, we're in particular looking for information that will take objects down at a distance. Well, what kind of objects? Flying objects. Okay. Unidentified flying objects? So this is very interesting. And just get a picture in your mind. You're in Hawaii somewhere and there's a craft going over the UK and you press a button and you take down. This is the thing that Tesla apparently was working on and that they were concerned about and wanted a piece of. That's why they sent him in. Those are his exact instructions from them. They weren't saying, hey, find us this fancy atomic thing. They were saying, find us the information he has about taking flying objects down at a distance. If you just add unidentified to that, I think you get the whole picture of what he was doing there. Yes.
I have never seen so many CIA trolls. It is so, they're really nervous about
3-letter
this
agencies,
episode.
4-letter words, 5-star general. Well, I'll take this opportunity to say, though, that that the nature of the episode that we're bringing forward on the 24th and the 25th will include information that has not been made public before. And so I want to make sure that everyone tunes in for that. We're going to take a couple more questions, and I'm going to read the final piece here dealing with Stockdale. Don't worry, I'm going to do an entire separate overview on Stockdale. And I do think that it's important for us to look at the curve from 1963 through the Reagan era. And there are Reagan things that I wanted to get to tonight, but we'll do it another time. One thing I will say in relation to this curve, though, is that the curve we're going into for 2024, now that Kennedy is going to run, and by the way, I've heard in the background now that is solid. Okay, so he raised it. He said his wife okayed it. He went to New Hampshire and he said he was considering it. That was last week. I've heard in the background myself that Kennedy is running. So, step for Biden. Better get that hearing aid cranked up. Okay.
Okay, Blazing River. Was there ever a connection between JFK and Admiral Byrd? Both were Navy. And Sarah Ajagu, who is your best guess as the Earth ambassador to the extraterrestrial overlords?
Well, the connection with JFK and Byrd is interesting because D.H. Byrd owned the Texas School Book Depository, and he was the cousin of Admiral Byrd. And in fact, if you really think about where Lee Harvey Oswald was showing up for work that day, it's quite fascinating because D.H. Byrd had invested in an aerospace company that did experimental craft. So again, Oswald, who had just come from working in New Orleans for Guy Bannister, who had been in charge of the X file of UFOs and had investigated saucer sightings in the Pacific Northwest. Then he moves from that job, which was a UFO with a UFO connection, and he goes and he works over at the Texas School Book Depository, whose owner is an oil man, yes, whose cousin is Admiral Byrd, who went to Antarctica. So there's an Antarctica connection. And also he's the biggest investor in Limco Vout, a experimental aerospace company, which after the Kennedy assassination will make tons of money on military helicopters in Vietnam. I mean, this is pretty hardcore. Yes.
Jamie Hatfield, given the corrupt agencies all have their agendas, who could repair the American vote?
Well, I think the attention that's been given to the shenanigans around the voting over the last few years has put a spotlight on it, which would make it harder to pull off the types of shenanigans that they pulled just recently. However, I think there's been a lot of that kind of activity for decades. So therefore, it's only paper ballots that could restore confidence in that, in my opinion. And it seems like the digital systems, which are trying to sue any news agency like Newsmax or Fox, who any of their announcers raised the possibility that Dominion might be up to something. Look, you can't have voting be proprietary to a company. That's anti-democratic at its core. So it happens in Congress and it happens with presidential leadership. That's the kind of thing that you can do. And I think it should all be paper ballots. And by the way, that doesn't slow anything down. They use paper ballots in Brazil and they get the results lickety split that night. There's no, what did they introduce this thing now? They're like, hey, it's normal to wait 2 or 3 weeks for results. No, it ain't. Usually you get the results that day, or if it's extremely close, you'll have to wait one extra day, maybe. But you get presidential results the night it happens. And this other thing that happened during the COVID op, that's totally different. That's totally different. The way that they did that, that's never been allowed. And they talked about it with this past election. They said, oh, yeah, the Biden administration was up there saying, yeah, it takes a few weeks to count the stuff. It's just it's an inversion. It's a twisting of reality. I mean, this doesn't have anything to do with anything. No, that's completely untrue. And it's never been true before. So, where do you go with that? Yes.
Talent shenanigans. So let me see here.
Yeah.
Here's getting straight to the point. Is he the Great? Will the CIA allow Bobby Kennedy to take the presidency?
I'm not even, I'm sure that groups like that aren't happy about it, but, I don't think that plays into any decision that he would make about it. And I don't think it should play into any decisions of the incredible support that should be behind him for this. We're here in this day and time to try to fix things on this level now. And we have that incredible background of the sacrifice of Bobby Jr.'s family. So, now is the time. This is the place. I wanted to bring up an interesting thing to round out the Stockdale thing. Then we'll take one last question and then we're out. I mentioned
I have so many questions that I haven't been able to ask yet.
Well, we're going to have quite a show, a series of shows coming up, and if you hold them aside, we definitely will. But yes, they've been fantastic. The Ideas Room is on fire tonight, and you've been doing incredible. So thank you very much. I did mention Oswald there, and remember, there was no evidence against Oswald. All the evidence was cooked up. And remember that the magic bullet never happened. It's been proven, stupid thing, And also wasn't on the 6th floor because Sandra Stiles was going down the stairs at the time. He would have had to have run back down to see Marion Baker and the manager of the school book depository in Texas. And she never saw anybody on the stairs. And so what we got is 90 seconds after the shooting is Oswald in the 2nd floor lunchroom, and that's where the cop encounters him. So the rest of it was just a fantasy that LBJ and the rest of the gang did. I also want to point out, Hoover and his involvement in all this, and the fact that he detested Kennedy and wanted to use blackmail against him and was thwarted by RFK Jr. We have to remember the nature of the battles that are going on here, and that it's a much deeper thing than just, how they lay it out as, the Kennedys hated so-and-so or whatever. You have to remember the forces that people like Hoover represented. And then you have to remember the forces that people like Dulles represented. And when you include the aerospace aspect in that, then, of course, you have segments like the mafia, and you have these other things, but the aerospace thing then becomes the key. And in the heart of the aerospace problem is the UFO file. So you have to include those to understand that historical picture correctly. And then we get some understanding of how they pulled off the assassination. They had the control of the CIA and the FBI covering the tracks of the thing. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Coldossi, DJ, what is your point of view on the fact that it is almost impossible to get into candidacy in U.S. politics unless you have any of those backers? Makes it hard for honesty to thrive.
Sure.
And Jimmy Lyle Kennemer, the left is going to throw the kitchen sink at trying to shut down RFK Jr. over his stance on vaccines.
That is an incredible point.
Yeah.
Well, the left hates Bobby Jr. way, way more than the right does. And, you know, the right actually has a lot of respect for Kennedy because of his family's background and also his own principled stance against, you know, the CDC and other things like that who were using this and against the pharmaceutical companies. So I think when we get into that and we're looking at Kennedy's advent into the race, his biggest obstacle is going to be that Democratic base itself. He actually is a very viable candidate to capture the ultimate election, but winning the nomination in that corrupt DNC environment is very difficult. However, deep, deep down in those Democratic roots is a deep love for Kennedy and for everything that Kennedy created, his father and his uncle, President Kennedy. So, in my opinion, that changes the equation a little bit. It makes things maybe a little more viable. You look at more switching going on. And if Biden's support collapses as it's, you know, it's getting worse and worse, you know, it's only the media that's been holding this guy up, and I think that they're sick of it. Then I think it could be anybody's ball game. And Kennedy would be well positioned if he gets the opportunity to win the primary in New Hampshire to come in heavy with the election. So if they move the New Hampshire primary, which they're trying to do, they're trying to thwart that initial momentum boost. That's where kind of the battle plays out at this stage. So the people of New Hampshire need to go to the DNC, you know, as Democrats and say, you know, it's not going to work. You can't do that. The Republicans aren't doing that. They don't want to move the primary. Why are you moving ours? You can't do it. And, you know, those people at the DNC, if they override their own people, they should face a revolt in the state of New Hampshire. And that revolt should be at the ballot box, and they should throw the DNC out and reinvent the whole thing. It's been captured a long time ago anyway, you know, and, you know, on this channel and with my show, I don't take a political position against any particular party in terms of favoritism, but the Democrats are acting nuts, like beyond crazy, as the leadership of the Republican Party has also. But the Republicans in charge of Congress now are raising more important issues than the Democrats, and the Democrats are just completely captured. So,
can I say something about that?
Yeah.
Naomi Wolf did a fantastic Substack today.
Oh, yeah, she did. And it was an apology to conservatives.
Yes. Actually, all Republicans, period.
Yeah, that's interesting. And she was talking about how basically, you know, the DNC and the Democrats went over the top, just lying to win and to control people and to demonize the other half of the population, probably with help from China. So, you know, I mean, this is happening a lot. A lot of the Democratic base, you know, even people who don't, like Matt Taibbi, for example, he'll do something like the Twitter files. It's not that deep, but it's, you know, it doesn't buy the Democrat rhetoric. So you have a Democrat there, a real leftist Democrat, turning against the Democratic Party. Glenn Greenwald, you know, this is a person who tried to get the Edward Snowden information out, right? And he was totally on the left. What happened to him? He thinks that this Democratic establishment is the most corrupt thing on the planet. These aren't Trump fans, you know, these are leftists, and they don't like this thing. This thing is so far left and crazy that it doesn't even resemble lefty politics. It's a thing. And that's the fact. And this is what I think Bobby Kennedy is doing. I think he's bringing this forward the same exact way and saying, look, you're trying to move the first in the nation primary to favor, Biden, who's not all there mentally. What does that say to people? So he knows. And this is why 2024 is going to be exceptional. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Okay, I'm going to read one thing here. We're going to take one final question, and then we will kind of round things out. What do you got over there?
I'm actually just going to ask you. I see no other way, even though it's really early and anything can happen, that we're going to have a third party candidate, if not a fourth. I think it is.
Oh yeah,
it's going to be a wacky election cycle.
It's really true.
What do you feel in your gut is going to happen?
Well, let's take a quick, walk down memory lane on third party candidates. Perot won 20% of the vote. That's pretty good. Had he not got out and got back in and had that weird story about, oh, I thought the Republicans were going to ruin my daughter's wedding, or what? I don't know what that was all about, but he
clearly his family was threatened. There's no question.
So, but 20% of the vote as an independent is an incredible achievement. And considering that Clinton won with only 42% of the vote, so that's not a lot. I think it was actually 41. But this is an interesting thing about independents and how they strive to keep them out. And they always run this libertarian candidate, and he always gets about 1% of the vote. But the libertarians have been able to put a candidate on the different voting ballots in every state. So they've got that part down. They just need to get someone who's a successful candidate going. And I think that they stand the best chance in that sense, especially in this environment where the government and activist government has proven so corrupt. But if you go back again, you can find John Anderson running in 1980. And Anderson's weird thing too, because he came out of the Republican Party and he was like, I can't go with Reagan on the hard right and Carter's a disaster, so I'm going to run. And he looked pretty good for a while. He actually comes in with 7% of the vote in 1980. But if you go back further still to Teddy Roosevelt, after he left the presidency, he runs and he creates a party called the Bull Moose, and he almost wins. But that sort of scrap in the Republican side allows Wilson to get in. So there's a great power in a third party in that it can control a certain amount of the electorate. Can a third party actually get in? Well, it has to be organized so that it's on every ballot for starters. And then I think if you're coming from that place, then you can do it. But it takes that kind of money and grassroots effort to do it. And I think that people like Ron Paul and like Trump, even though they had values that were independent, ran under the Republican umbrella because, it was spread out solid and you knew you could win. And in fact, Ron Paul, I think they had him as the libertarian candidate in the 80s, and he couldn't get very far because, again, the Libertarian Party they have a lot of great ideas, actually, but they don't have the heft of the organization to make the whole thing work. But yes, I think you will see a third party candidate. That's an excellent question, actually.
Yeah, everyone in the ideas room is saying that Michelle Obama is going to be the candidate and not Biden.
Oh, yeah, for the Democrats.
Yes.
A lot of people have pointed that out. Michelle Obama doesn't have any experience.
Doesn't matter.
And true, but I think it would be a weak choice.
She checks a lot of boxes, which is all they seem to care about nowadays.
Well, if they thought they were getting Obama in the guise of Michelle, then I guess it would have a shot. And I certainly, on the media side, they would push it, but on the reality side, it's a disastrous idea,
Mm-hmm.
But then again, they're coming out of Biden, so another walking disaster. But whenever we get into this presidential thing, it can go a lot of different directions. But I will say this, that Kennedy's announcement is a surprise. and because there's a lot of things associated with Kennedy's running for president. John, who won against Nixon and barely got in, has this revolutionary program of freedom. And really, for 3 years in the White House, less than 3 years, I mean, just an incredible set of accomplishments that he had. We have to wonder what would have happened with him in there for a solid 8 years. Robert Kennedy would have done dramatic things, I think, in relation to our stance around the globe, warlike stance. And I think, obviously his entering, and he was doing incredibly well. He was going to get the nomination. And so he's assassinated. So instantly when we go into this, now Ted Kennedy did get through the nominating process against Carter, and Carter beat him. But he did have some weird incidents, actually, where there was an assassination attempt that was attached to Anton LaVey, of all people. So that was very strange. And also there was a woman who came into his office and put a knife in his desk or something. So he had some weirdness too. So there's no doubt whenever you mention the Kennedy around this, there's a fears of assassination and things like that. But I think in this case that Bobby Kennedy has already faced an incredible machine. And I think at this point in his life that he's 69 years old and he's already been through a number of battles. And he must just feel that call to do this, to straighten his own party out. Because I'll tell you, the Democrats are they're just completely captured. So something like this could be dramatic and bring back the kind of roots of the whole thing. And we could only benefit. I think it would be dramatic and it would be fantastic to have Kennedy versus Trump. I would cover that with glee. I think we could get a lot of great things going there. All right, you've done a fantastic job with your questions tonight. A couple of quick things there. That was Bobby Baker, by the way, who I mentioned earlier. LBJ's man behind the scenes, doing crimes and then eventually doing time. But he seemed to be at the heart of all this. Somebody, since I mentioned George Smathers in the middle of all this earlier, I'm just going to round that out here. And one of the things is that Smathers had two very interesting people working for him. One of them was Mary Jo Kopechne, interestingly enough. And Mary Jo Kopechne would die in a tragic accident with Ted Kennedy going over the Chappaquiddick Bridge. But she joined the campaign to help Robert Kennedy become president. And before that, she was working for Smathers because she thought Smathers was best friends with Kennedy. And then she learned as she was in that office, oh, he actually is anti-Kennedy. And she started to give information to the Kennedys about that. It makes you wonder. Interestingly enough, here's just a little snippet about Mary Jo in relation to this. Mary Jo Kopechne had taken the job at Smathers' secretary only because she had initially believed him to be a close personal friend of the president. When she discovered deeply disturbed her a few days before JFK's departure to engage in pre-election year appearances in Florida and Texas, John Kennedy stopped by Smathers' Senate office to complain to him his irritation at having tried to resolve these party spats, which he felt you and Lyndon should be handling. I don't want to go to Texas. Smathers grandly made a show of it by grinning broadly and warmly hugging the president. Nonsense, he replied. You have to make these trips, Jack. Yeah, kind of interesting. Kopechne noted, much to her dismay, the right-wing Florida Solon voted against Jack Kennedy's legislative proposals 62% of the time. That is our friend Smathers. So he was voting against JFK. I think that's important. And here's that little anecdote I shared earlier. He incessantly pushed Castro's assassination to JFK until finally one evening, Kennedy so forcefully replied in the negative to his alleged friend that the normally imperturbable president broke his White House dinner plate with the thrust of a fork downward in emphasizing his anger at Smathers' ceaseless insistence that Kennedy assassinate Castro. Bang, a broken plate. I think that says quite a lot. And another kind of just side thing is the roommate of Mary Jo Kopechne when she worked for Smathers was in a relationship with Bobby Baker. And Bobby Baker had also started this relationship with his secretary, Nancy Carroll Taylor. She lived with Mary Jo Kopechne, who worked for George Smathers. This is Nancy Carroll Taylor. And interestingly enough, this is what Baker had to say. What started as a harmless affair eventually evolved into a romance. I grew to love Carol Taylor, young and beautiful and vivacious, at once a former beauty queen in quick mind and a flair for politics. She was not difficult to love, though I knew the guilt of a longtime family man with a loyal wife and 5 children. I did nothing to discourage our romance once it began. Here's what's interesting. A year later, she goes down, Nancy Carroll Taylor goes down in a plane crash. A few years later, Mary Jo Kopechne is gone. Both of them had that connection with Bakers and Smathers. So, the more we kind of unpeel those incidents and what took place in 1963 and all the reverberations after the fact, here's another weird thing to consider. Chappaquiddick happened on the very same night of what?
I don't know.
The moon landing.
Oh.
So, we're looking at a deep state activity, and the implications are deep, and the disclosure piece is right in the heart of it. And there's a group there that is poised to deny that disclosure and will keep the wall of secrecy in place, but they will provide false disclosure. So it's a very kind of dangerous time as we come forward with that. But what I will say is the president who wins in 2024 and takes office in 2025 will be faced with the task of some kind of disclosure. So it's going to come as the false CIA threat disclosure, UFO threat disclosure, or we're going to get some aspect of the real thing. So shaping up for a Trump-Kennedy race could put us there. If it's Biden or Gavin Newsom or whatever, you're going to have, the deep state in action trying to take down either of these guys. So we're in for some very, very heavy reporting on that. And by the way, I'm going to follow this as a series inside the X series, a series of episodes we're going to do on this for the X series following this 63 to 2024 election until we get to that election place. And with that, Miss Olivia, your last question.
It's not a question, it's a comment. Edward Peters says, Dark Journalist for Press Secretary. I actually think you'd be awesome at Press Secretary. You'd love it.
There's no question about it. Well, if anything, if I could get the facts on the ground out about this election in a fair manner so that, everyone in the ideas room gets a shot at hearing what's actually going on. And I really do feel that the disclosure aspect in the UFO file is going to come in heavy with the 2024 election. And I think the phony shoot downs of the balloons and all that stuff are giving us an idea that they may pull the UFO threat thing, which, by the way, was in part of the playbook of Hillary's campaign. If they felt like they were losing, one of the scenarios that they had in her campaign materials behind the scenes was we could basically fake that there was an alien invasion happening and it would discourage people from voting in large numbers for Trump. So, don't tell me that's not in their bag of tricks, but certainly the things that we're going to watch for, the continuity of government program, the UFO file secrecy, and then the fluff on top, you're going to see, weapon this, threat that, all that kind of piece. And then I think right now that Biden thinks he can run again. And but if Kennedy takes him on hard, they're going to do everything to strip Kennedy of the opportunity to engage with him directly. So I think we're looking at a real battle for the heart of America. And we'll be watching it real closely for you. And with that, Miss Olivia, your super
Okay,
chats.
I have a large group of super chatters to thank. Gil and Joy R, Ramblin' Lamb, Eurythmia's Fun, Ghost Malone, Terry Doherty, Jimmy Lyle Kennemer, Erica Swenson Elliott, Debbie McAdoo, Izzy the Great, BC, Wait a Minute 72, Thomas Ball, Robert Scott, Bill Gometz, Occult Fan, Fulcanelli, Doyle Wayne, Floor A, Global Atlantis, D. Ware, Mooney Rich, Calvin Center, Cursacella, Johnny Ricardo Bown, Doreen Hewitt, Lisa Frequency, Anthony, Infinitum Neo, Jim McMurphy, 321, Servant Michael, Charlotte Key, Redcap Goblin, Bobo the Clown, and Gen X Nerd. Thank you so much.
Unbelievable. We really appreciate your support. And to all our subscribers, you make it happen and you give us that ability to put together these reports for you. We'll be back with you next week. And then, of course, don't miss the two-part X Series 5-year anniversary, and that will be March 24th and 25th at 8 p.m. respectively, Friday and Saturday evenings. I'll do a couple of shout-outs here. Hey, there's Gigi Young. We're going to have Gigi Young back on. I actually, there's some things that are going on that are, we just need Gigi's insight on. So I cannot wait. And she's in high demand here, doing great work over at her own channel, Gigi Young, on YouTube. And please check it out. Najat, it's great to see you. God, what a night. I agree. Oh, what a night. Ciao, y'all. Like that. Carlos. Julie Kemener, awesome show, Olivia and DJ. Thank you very much, sir. Deborah Sloan. Thanks, DJ and Olivia. Oh, that thing's going fast now. I always love that. Yes. Pono's out there. Elizabeth. Jennifer Walters. Jammin' Mommy. Is that it?
Mammy. Jammin' Mammy.
I see it. Check out Old World, Florida. Okay. Mr. Wolf's out there. Wolfing it up. Thank you, sir. Take care, DJ and Olivia. Astro in Motion 2023. Even better. That's this year. Yes.
By the way, did you know David Tormina said, DJ, it was Smathers who arranged the purchase of Nixon's Winter White House on Key Biscayne.
He did some
and introduced Nixon to Bibi Rebozo.
That's exactly right. Yes, he was good friends with Rebozo. So I think that lets us know where he's coming from a whole heck of a lot better. Great point. Awesome show, DJ and Olivia. Many thanks. Thank you very much. And we appreciate it. It's been great being with all of you. Undestroyer, Karen Carpenter, Gen X Nerd. That's a great name. Olivia for press secretary.
No,
even
I
better.
couldn't handle
Can you
that pressure. No way.
Outstanding. I know Kate's out there. It's great to see you. Scarlet Fire.
Actually, Kate had a great comment.
What was it?
She said, Epstein's pilot said RFK Jr. was the only person he doesn't remember on the plane.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Wow, that says a lot. That's important, I think, as well, to know that he can't be fooled, and didn't deal with that crowd. Salt of the Earth, Golden Girl. Salt of the Earth says, love your show. Well, we love you being here. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. We will see you all next week. And like I said, we'll be back with the 5-year anniversary 2-part special. You're not going to miss it. In the meantime, if you're new here and you haven't already, sign up for the Dark Journalist newsletter at darkjournalist.com. And yes, what do you got?
Peter Bayonne says, anyone ever hear of aquatic humanoid shape-shifting entities? Just met someone who has had extensive experience with them.
Aquatic,
Yeah, admin at darkjournalist.com if you have any contacts.
Send it over, Red Rover.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Trident vibes. Listen in the car, waiting for a friend. Excellent show, guys. Thank you very much, Trident. Appreciate it. Great to have you with us. And just a great crew in here tonight. Tricky Vicky's out there. Fantastic. Jen Passivant. Hail, hail. The gang's all here. Much love to you as well. We will see you all next week. And we're in it now. We're in it for the long haul. It's going to be an exciting 2024 after all. And, it says end broadcast, but we know
Never really ends.
It never really ends. And never let it be forgot that once there was a Camelot, and maybe someday it comes again. Joseph, of course, out there. It's great to have you here, sir. We will see you all next week. Have a great night.
Thanks, everybody. God bless.